Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The quietness of the forest was what had drawn me to the little cabin in the first place. After years of city noise and endless chaos, I thought a retreat in the woods would do me good. I'd rented the cabin online, a quaint little structure nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness. It was isolated, no neighbors for miles, and surrounded by thick trees and winding trails that stretched as far as the eye could see. It seemed perfect for the solitude I desperately craved. The day I arrived, everything felt right. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the cabin, though rustic, had everything I needed: a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen. There was no cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect and immerse myself in nature. For the first few days I explored the nearby trails. They were narrow and winding, some barely visible under the thick undergrowth, but they were beautiful. Birds chirped overhead, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze created a soothing soundtrack. I felt at peace for the first time in months, but by the third day something shifted. It started with small things. While walking one of the trails, I found a pair of shoes sitting in the middle of the path. They were old, worn-out hiking boots covered in mud and moss. At first I thought someone might have left them there by accident, but as I looked closer I noticed they were perfectly aligned, as if someone had carefully placed them there. Something about it felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. I shrugged it off and continued my hike, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The woods felt different, quieter. Somehow. The birds that had been so vocal the previous days were silent, and the rustling of leaves seemed sharper, more deliberate, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. That night, as though I sat by the fireplace, I thought I heard footsteps outside. It was faint, just the crunching of leaves and twigs, but it was enough to make me pause. I turned off the music I'd been playing on my old portable speaker and strained to listen. The sound came again, closer. This time I told myself it was probably an animal: deer. Raccoons, even bears, were common in these parts. But the pacing of the steps didn't feel animalistic. They were too many, measured, too human. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding far more nervous than I intended. The only response was silence. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but all I saw were the dark, twisting branches. After a few minutes I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day I tried to put the incident behind me. I stuck to a new trail, one that looped back toward the cabin, so I wouldn't wander too far. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The air was still, and the unease from the night before lingered in the back of my mind. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks: a small clearing with a circle of rocks in the center. At first glance it looked like a simple fire pit, but as I approached I realized the rocks were arranged in an intricate pattern. Inside the circle were small wooden carvings, crudely shaped into human-like figures. They were scattered haphazard, their twisted forms lying in the dirt. I bent down to pick one up, and, as I did, I noticed something carved into the rock just outside the circle. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. It looked ancient, almost primal, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't linger. Something about the clearing felt wrong. Like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. That night the footsteps returned. They were louder, this time circling the cabin. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. The sound was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate steps crunching through the underbrush. They would stop for a moment, then resume, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were close. I thought about running to my car, but the idea of stepping outside terrified me. The cabin suddenly felt like a fragile barrier, its thin walls barely keeping me safe from whatever was lurking in the darkness. Eventually the footsteps stopped and the forest fell silent once more. But I didn't sleep. That night, I sat in the corner of the room, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the sound to return. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. I packed my things and prepared to leave. As I loaded my bag into the car, I noticed something on the windshield, a handprint. It was faint, smudged, as though it had been made in the early hours of the morning when the glass was damp with condensation. The size of the print was unsettling, too large to be a child's, but not quite the size of an average adult's hand. The fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. I didn't waste any more time. I started the car and drove away, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The winding road back to town felt longer than I remembered, and the trees lining the path seemed to press closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But it wasn't over. A few miles down the road I saw something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the path. I slowed the car, squinting to get a better look. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and his head slightly tilted as if he were studying me. I stopped the car, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly. My knuckles turned white. The man didn't move. He just stood there staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and then slowly he raised his hand and pointed to the forest. I don't know what came over me, but I hit the gas and swerved around him, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As I sped away, I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. When I finally reached the edge of town, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I looked at the car's clock. It was just past noon, but it felt like hours had passed since I left the cabin. I never went back. I didn't call the owner to explain, and I didn't leave a review. I just wanted to forget. But even now, months later, I can't. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the feeling that I'm being watched. I'll hear faint footsteps outside my window or catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the tree line, and every now and then I'll find a handprint on my car, SMUD and faint, but unmistakably there. I don't know who or what I encountered in those woods, but one thing is certain, I was never alone out there. There's a house on Ridgeway Road that people avoid. It sits at the end of a long overgrown driveway shrouded in trees so dense they block out most of the sunlight. The house is old Victorian style, with peeling paint and broken shutters. No one lives there, or at least no one is supposed to. I first learned about the house when I was 13. My friends and I were at that age when scaring each other was a favorite pastime, and the Ridgeway house was the perfect material. Rumors circulated endlessly. A family had died there under mysterious circumstances. A man went insane and murdered his wife. The place was cursed. But there was one story that stuck with me, a story about a woman who still roamed the halls, her face hidden behind a veil. I hadn't thought about that house in years, not until recently when I moved back to my hometown. My job had taken me away for nearly a decade, but when my mother passed I decided to return and settle her affairs. It felt strange being back, like stepping into a memory I hadn't meant to revisit. The house on Ridgeway Road was still there, looking even more decrepit than I remembered. Every time I drove past it, I felt the same sense of unease I had as a child. The air around it seemed heavier, colder, like the house carried its own atmosphere. I told myself it was just nostalgia playing tricks on me. That changed. One rainy evening I was driving home from work, tired and distracted. When my car sputtered to a stop, the engine died completely, leaving me stranded on Ridgeway Road, right in front of the house. My stomach tightened as I glanced at the dark silhouette of the house. Through the downpour, the rain was coming down in sheets, making it impossible to see clearly, but I could feel its presence looming over me. I tried restarting the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. My phone had no signal, of course, so calling for help was out of the question. I sat there for a moment weighing my options when I noticed something, a faint light flickering in one of the windows. I froze. No one was supposed to live there. The house had been abandoned for decades. And yet the light was unmistakable, a soft yellow glow that danced like candlelight. I told myself it must be a trick of the rain, a reflection, anything but what it seemed to be. Then it moved. The light shifted from one window to the next like someone was carrying it through the house. My breath caught in my throat as I watched. Unable to look away, I thought I saw a shadow pass behind the glass, a tall, thin figure that disappeared as quickly as it came. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The rain soaked through my clothes almost instantly, and the wind howled like a living thing, urging me to turn back. But something about that light drew me in. I had to know what it was, who or what was in that house. The driveway was slick with mud, and the trees seemed to close in around me as I approached the house. The closer I got, the colder the air became until my breath came out in visible puffs, despite the summer heat. When I reached the front steps, I hesitated. The house loomed over me like a giant, its broken windows staring down like empty eyes. I pushed the door open, it wasn't locked, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a mixture of mildew, damp wood, and something metallic like rust or old blood. The interior was just as I'd imagined it would be, with dusty furniture covered in white sheets, wallpaper peeling from the walls, and cobwebs draped across the corners. But it wasn't the state of the house that unsettled me. It was the silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your own breathing sound too loud. The light I'd seen outside was nowhere to be found. The hallway was dark, the air thick, with a sense of wrongness. I couldn't explain. I should have turned around and left, but something kept me there, some mix of fear and curiosity that rooted me to the spot. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response, only the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I moved deeper into the house, my flashlight sweeping over the walls. Strange markings were carved into the wood symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, like they had been there for years, but they felt fresh, somehow as if the act of carving them had left a residue behind. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the beam caught something at the end of the hallway, a figure. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was tall and thin, wearing a tattered black dress. Her face was obscured by a dark veil, just like the stories from my childhood. She stood completely still. Her head tilted slightly to one side as if she were watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the staircase. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and something about the way her fingers curled sent a wave of nausea through me. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the stairs. The woman didn't follow. She remained at the end of the hallway, her veiled face tilted in my direction. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, the sound echoing through the empty house. When I reached the top, I saw another faint light coming from a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and the glow seeped through the crack like liquid. I approached slowly, my flashlight flickering with every step. When I reached the door, I pushed it open and froze. The room was empty, except for a single chair. In the center on the chair sat a candle, its flame burning steadily despite the draft coming through. The broken window surrounding the chair were more of the strange carvings etched into the floor in a chaotic, haphazard pattern, and then I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was standing in the doorway. Her veil fluttered slightly, as if moved by an unseen breeze. She stepped closer, and, as she did, the candle flame grew brighter, casting her shadow across the walls. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light like they were alive. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't stop. Her movements were slow but purposeful, her head tilting again as she reached for me. Her hand was pale and skeletal. The skin stretched tight over bone, and then I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her veil slipped just enough for me to glimpse hollow eye sockets and a twisted, unnatural grin. I don't remember much. After that I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew I was lying in my car. The rain still pouring outside, the house was dark, its windows empty. My flashlight was on the passenger seat, but I had no memory of retrieving it. I drove straight home, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first, but the nightmares began almost immediately. Dreams of her standing at the foot of my bed, her hollow eyes staring at me through the veil, dreams of the symbols burning into my skin, and sometimes late at night I think I hear footsteps outside my window, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I don't look, I don't dare, I don't know what I encountered in that house, but one thing is certain, it wasn't just a story, and whatever it was, it hasn't forgotten me. I've always been drawn to the water. As a child, I spent hours swimming in lakes, rivers, and ponds, feeling the cool embrace of the water wash away. Whatever worries I had when I turned 30, I decided to buy a small lakefront cabin in northern Minnesota. It was remote, quiet, and surrounded by thick woods, a perfect escape from the noise of the city. The lake itself was stunning. It stretched for miles, its surface reflecting the sky like a giant mirror. The water was dark and deep, bordered by reeds that whispered in the wind. Locals called it Blackwater Lake, an apt name given its near-opaque depths. Stories about the lake floated around town, but I dismissed them as superstitions. Tales of drowned victims who were never found or fishermen who claimed to hear voices from the water at night were nothing more than folklore. I thought the cabin was simple but cozy, and after settling in, I began a routine of early morning swims. I loved the solitude of the lake in the early hours, when the mist clung to the surface and the world felt still. It was during one of these swims that I first noticed something strange. The morning had been cloudy, the lake unusually eerily calm. I had just reached the middle of the lake, where the water was at its deepest. When I felt a sudden shift in the temperature, the water around me turned ice cold, far colder than it should have been for late summer. At first I thought it was a current, but the chill didn't pass. It stayed with me, wrapping around my body like icy tendrils. Then I saw it, a shadow beneath me, long and indistinct, gliding just out of reach. My breath hitched as I treaded water, trying to convince myself. It was a large fish, but the shadow moved unnaturally, too fluid and deliberate, as if it were aware of my presence. It circled me once before disappearing into the darkness. I swam back to the shore as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the dock, I turned back to look at the water, half expecting to see the shadow rise from the depths. But the surface was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened for the next few days. I avoided swimming in the lake, though I couldn't stay away entirely. I'd sit on the dock watching the water, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the shadow, but the feeling of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a book, I heard a faint splash, followed by the sound of ripples lapping against the shore. It wasn't unusual for fish to break the surface, but this was different. The sound was heavier, deliberate, as if something larger had entered the water. I stood and walked to the edge of the dock, peering into the lake. The sun had just set and the water was dark, almost black. I could see nothing beyond the faint reflection of the moon. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement, a ripple spreading across the surface. Coming from the center of the lake, a figure emerged, barely visible against the water's darkness. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its head too narrow, and its eyes glowed faintly like twin lanterns beneath the surface. It stared at me unmoving, as if studying me. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the water. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the ripples remained spreading outward, like a warning. That night I locked every door and window in the cabin. Though it brought little comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I lay in bed with the covers pulled tight around me. The woods outside were eerily quiet, the usual chorus of crickets and frogs absent, and then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again, a splash closer, this time followed by the sound of wet footsteps on the dock. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as they approached the cabin. They stopped just outside my window. I didn't dare look. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that whatever it was would go away. The next morning I found wet footprints on the porch. They were human in shape but much larger. The toes elongated and claw-like. They trailed off toward the woods, disappearing into the underbrush. I considered leaving the cabin that day, but something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the irrational belief that I could explain everything away. I told myself the footprints were a prank, that the figure I'd seen was just my imagination. But deep down I knew better. Over the next few nights the activity escalated. I would wake to the sound of splashing and whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the lake. Once I heard what sounded like my name carried on the wind. It was soft, almost tender, but it sent chills down my spine. I started keeping a flashlight and a knife by my bed, though I doubted they would do any good. Then came the night. I'll never forget. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep when I heard a loud bang. It came from the dock as if something heavy had been thrown onto it. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, my heart racing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dock. At first I saw nothing. The dock was empty, the water still, but then the beam caught something, a hand pale and skeletal gripping the edge of the dock. Slowly a figure pulled itself up, emerging from the water like a knife. Nightmare made flesh. It was the same figure I'd seen before, but now it was closer, clearer. Its skin was translucent, its bones visible beneath the surface. Algae and water plants clung to its body and its glowing eyes were fixed on me. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, and let out a guttural sound that sent me stumbling back in terror. It began to move toward the cabin, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it crawled across the dock. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the back door, running into the woods without looking back. The branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, the sound of wet footsteps and guttural breaths growing louder. Somehow I made it to my car. I started the engine and peeled out of there, not caring that I'd left most of my belongings behind. I drove straight to town, not stopping until I reached the safety of a brightly lit gas station. I didn't go back to the cabin. I hired someone to collect my things, and when they asked why I was leaving, I simply said the place didn't suit me. I didn't want to tell them the truth, didn't want to admit what I'd seen, but I can't forget it. Every time I see a body of water I feel that same unease, that same sense of being watched, and sometimes late at night I hear the sound of splashing in my dreams. I wake up drenched in sweat, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I don't know what's in Blackwater Lake, and I don't want to know. All I know is that it's still there, waiting, watching, and it's not music alone. I've worked as a night nurse for over 10 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. Hospitals are like that, places of life, death, and everything in between, but nothing I'd experienced before prepared me for what happened during my last shift at St. Alden's Hospital. St. Alden's was an older building, a crumbling maze of long corridors and dim lighting. The hospital had been built in the 1920s, and while the upper floors had been renovated, the basement wing where the psych ward used to be remained mostly untouched. The administrators kept the area locked, using it only for storage, but every now and then the janitors would whisper about noises down there, doors creaking, faint laughter and whispers that no one could explain. We all brushed it off as typical late-night paranoia, that is, until room 306 became part of my rounds. Room 306 had been empty for years. Located at the far end of the fourth-floor wing, where most long-term patients stayed, it was known among staff as the cold room. No matter how well the heating worked, it was always freezing in there. Maintenance couldn't figure out why. When new patients were assigned there, they complained about the cold, nightmares, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. After several complaints and one patient walking out in the middle of the night, the room was taken off the rotation. But last week the hospital was overcrowded and room 306 was reopened out of necessity. The patient assigned to it was a man named Henry, a homeless man in his 50s who had been found unconscious in an alley. He had no family, no ID, and no record of ever being treated before. We didn't know much about him other than that he was in poor health, his vitals unstable, and his eyes. His eyes didn't look right. They were yellowish and bloodshot, with a strange intensity that made me feel uneasy. Henry rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was hoarse and raspy, like he'd swallowed gravel. He mostly stared out the window, murmuring to himself in a language none of us recognized. The other nurses avoided his room, and I can't blame them. There was something unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end whenever I was near him. My shift started as usual that night. The halls were quiet, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows that flickered with the hum of the aging electrical system. My rounds were uneventful until I reached room 306. As I approached the door, I noticed it was ajar. A shiver ran down my spine. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. "Henry," I called, softly pushing the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the monitors. The bed was empty. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. "Henry, are you here?" The window was open, the curtains billowing in the cold night air. I walked over to close it, but, as I did, I heard a noise behind me, a faint, wet sound like something being dragged across the floor. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Henry was crouched in the corner of the room, his back to me. His hospital gown hung loosely from his thin frame, and his breathing was labored, each exhale a rattling wheeze. His hands were moving, scratching at the floor, with his nails carving strange looping symbols into the linoleum. "Henry, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low, guttural laugh that sent a wave of nausea through me. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me, and I wished he hadn't. His face was twisted, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. His eyes, they weren't human anymore. They were black, completely void, like twin abysses staring into my soul. I let it in. He whispered, his voice echoing as if multiple people were speaking at once. I let it in, and now it's here. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows on the walls lengthening and twisting, moving like they were alive. The symbols Henry had carved began to glow, faintly pulsing with an eerie red light, and then I felt it, a presence heavy and suffocating, filling the room like a living thing. The air grew colder, so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. Something was holding me in place, rooting me to the spot. Henry began to laugh again, louder, this time his head tilting back as if in ecstasy. The shadows gathered around him, swirling and coalescing into a form tall and grotesque, with limbs that seemed to stretch endlessly and a face that was nothing but a gaping void. It loomed over Henry, its presence so overwhelming that I felt like I was drowning in its darkness. "Help me," Henry whispered suddenly, his voice, breaking. His eyes met mine, and for a moment he looked like a terrified man, not the monster I'd seen moments ago. "Don't let it take me before I could react." The shadow enveloped him completely. His screams echoed through the room, piercing and inhuman, before being abruptly cut off the light from. The symbols flickered and died, and the room was plunged into total darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Henry was gone, the bed was empty, the floor bare. The symbols were gone as if they had never been there. I stumbled out of the room, my legs shaking, and alerted security. They searched the entire hospital but found no trace of Henry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I was placed on leave after that night, and I didn't argue I couldn't go back to St. Alden's. Not after what I seen, but even now, weeks later, I can't escape the feeling that something followed me home at night. I hear whispers in the darkness, faint and unintelligible, but undeniably there. I see shadows move in the corners of my vision, shapes that vanish when I turn to look, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I see Henry's face staring back at me, his black eyes full of terror and despair. I don't know what he let in, but I know it's still out there waiting, and I'm afraid it's waiting for me. The house on Redwood Lane had been vacant for as long as anyone could remember. A relic from the 1930s had sat hidden behind overgrown trees and a rusted iron gate, its faded white paint peeling away in strips. Rumors swirled about why no one stayed there for long, but when the price dropped to something I could actually afford, I didn't hesitate. I was a single woman in my 30s, desperate for a fresh start, and a secluded house on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place to begin again. The first day was uneventful. The house had a strange energy, sure, but nothing. I couldn't chew up to its age and disrepair. There were creaking floors, drafts that snuck through cracks in the windows, and a faint musty smell that hung in the air. Still, I felt a sense of accomplishment as I unpacked my things and started making the place feel like home. It was the second night when things began to change. I was lying in bed listening to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside, when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was pacing in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything, but the house had gone eerily silent. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it must have been the old wooden floors settling. I locked my bedroom door just in case and forced myself to go back to sleep the next morning. I found something odd on the dusty floor of the hallway outside my bedroom. There were footprints, barefoot, too large to be mine and leading nowhere. They started at one end of the hall and ended abruptly in front of my door, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably an animal that had somehow gotten inside, though deep down I knew that didn't make sense. Over the next few days the activity escalated. I'd find objects moved to strange places, a book from the living room placed on the kitchen counter, my keys on the floor by the front door. At night I'd hear faint whispers, just barely audible, but too indistinct to make out any words. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted across the hallway, too fast to be my imagination. I stood clutching my phone and called out, "Who's there?" The shadow didn't return, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was standing just out of sight. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the isolation and creaks of the old house were playing tricks on me. But things took a darker turn that Friday night. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a week of restless nights. Around 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of something scraping against the walls. It started softly but grew louder, as if sharp nails were dragging across the plaster. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the bedroom door, my heart racing. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued coming from the attic. I debated ignoring it, but my curiosity won out. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I climbed the creaky staircase leading to the attic. The air grew colder as I ascended and the scratching grew louder. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The attic door was slightly ajar and a dim flickering light spilled out into the stairwell. I didn't remember leaving any lights on up there. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The attic was empty, save for a few old boxes and a single flickering bulb dangling from the ceiling. But what caught my attention were the walls. They were covered in strange markings, symbols, and words scrolled in what looked like charcoal. They stretched from the floor to the ceiling, looping and twisting in intricate patterns. In the center of the room was a mirror. Its glass cracked and smudged. As I approached it, my reflection seemed wrong. It moved with me, but its expression was off, its eyes darker than they should have been, and then it smiled. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The mirror cracked further, a web of fractures spreading across its surface. The temperature in the attic plummeted and the symbols on the wall seemed to whine like they were alive. I ran. I spent that night locked in my car, parked at the end of the driveway. I didn't go back into the house until the sun came up. I should have left then, but something about the house held me there. I couldn't explain it. A pull like it didn't want me to leave. That night, I tried to sleep on the couch in the living room, thinking it would feel safer than being upstairs. But just as I was drifting off, I felt it, a hand cold and clammy brushing against my arm. I bolted upright, my eyes darting around the room. No one was there, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room in the corner near the fireplace. I saw it, a figure tall and shadowy. Its form indistinct but undeniably human. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had no face. And then it spoke. "Why did you come here?" Its voice was low and growly, like a growl, but it didn't come from the figure itself. It seemed to echo from every corner of the room surrounding me. I couldn't respond. I was frozen in fear, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The figure began to move, slowly advancing toward me. I scrambled off the couch and bolted for the door. My only thought to get as far away as possible. As I reached the front door, I heard it again, louder. "This time you can't leave." I didn't look back. I spent the next few days at a friend's house, too shaken. To return, I told myself I would hire movers to pack up my thing, that I'd never set foot in that house again. But something strange happened while I was gone. Every time I tried to sleep, I dreamed of the house of the symbols, the mirror, the shadow. And each time I heard that voice whispering my name, calling me back. I don't know why, but I went back. I couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it, but the pull was too strong to resist. The house was quiet. When I entered eerily, so the air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, and then I saw it on the floor of the living room. Carved into the wood were the words, "Welcome home." The pull to stay was stronger than ever, but I knew better. Now I grabbed the few belongings I could carry and ran, leaving everything else behind. I sold the house at a loss, never telling the new owners what I had experienced. But sometimes late at night I wake up to the sound of footsteps in my hallway and I wonder if I ever really left. I've always loved living in small, tight-knit communities. There's a sense of safety when you know your neighbors, where everyone looks out for one another. That's why I was thrilled to move into a charming little house on the edge of Whispering Pines, a picturesque town nestled in the mountains. It felt like the perfect place to start over after my divorce, a fresh check chapter in a peaceful, serene environment. The house was old but cozy, with a wraparound porch and large bay windows that overlooked the dense forest behind the property. It had been vacant for a couple of years, but the price was right and I was eager to settle in. The realtor had been vague about the previous owner, only mentioning they had moved suddenly. For the first week, everything was perfect. I spent my days unpacking, decorating, and getting to know the neighbors. People were friendly but a bit reserved, often glancing over my shoulder as if they were expecting someone else to appear. I chalked it up to small-town quirks and didn't think much of it. It wasn't until the second week that I started noticing strange things. The first incident happened late one night. I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the branches of the trees brushing against the windows, but as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was coming from the back D. I got up and peeked through the curtains, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. Instead I saw nothing, just the dark outline of the forest, the trees, swaying gently in the wind, shrugging it off. I locked the door and went to the next morning. I found muddy footprints on the porch, barefoot human footprints. They started at the edge of the forest and led straight to my back door. I called the local sheriff, a grizzled man named Hank, who arrived within the hour. He inspected the prints, scratched his head and assured me it was probably just a harmless prank by some teenagers. "Kids around here get bored," he said, "but I'll patrol the area tonight just to be sure." That evening I double-checked all the locks and closed the curtains before going to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and groan of the house felt magnified in the silence of the night. Around 3 a.m. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff. Hank arrived quickly, his cruiser's lights flashing as he searched the property. Again there was no sign of anyone, but this time there was something new. A single hand print smeared in dirt on my bedroom window. "Probably those damn kids again," Hank muttered, though his furrowed brow told me he wasn't entirely convinced. The following nights were worse. The tapping at the back door became more frequent, louder and more insistent. I stopped sleeping altogether, sitting up with a baseball bat by my side, waiting for whoever or whatever was tormenting me to show themselves. Then one night I saw it. I had left the porch light on, hoping it would deter anyone from approaching the house. Around midnight I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look out the window and froze. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure, tall, thin, and completely still. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, but I could feel its eyes on me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching. I closed the curtains and called the sheriff again, but by the time Hank arrived the figure was gone, leaving no trace behind. "You should think about getting a dog," he suggested, "or maybe an alarm system." I nodded, but deep down I knew that wouldn't help. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a prank or some bored teenager. The figure returned the next night and the night after that, always standing in the same spot, just beyond the trees. Watching. I tried to ignore it, but its presence was suffocating. Even during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I started noticing other things too, objects in the house moving on their own, faint, whispers coming from the forest and cold spots that seemed to follow me from room to room. Desperate for answers, I began asking my neighbors about the house's history. Most of them avoided the subject, their cheerful demeanor fading the moment I brought it up. But one older woman, Mr. S. Decker, finally told me the truth, the man who lived there before you. He wasn't right, she said, her voice trembling. He was convinced something was living in the woods watching him. He became obsessed, setting up cameras, writing notes, and drawing symbols all over the walls. We thought he'd lost his mind, but then one day he just disappeared, left everything behind and vanished. Her words sent a chill down my spine when I got home. I searched the house from top to bottom, looking for any signs of the previous owner's obsession. I found them in the attic boxes filled with notebooks, photographs, and crude drawings of a shadowy figure with long limbs and hollow eyes. One notebook caught my attention, Ion. The last entry read, "It wants the house. It won't let me leave, it won't let anyone leave." That night the figure came closer. I saw it clearly for the first time standing on the porch. Its face pressed against the glass of the back door. Its features were warped, almost human, but not quite. Its eyes were black voids and its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. I didn't wait to see what it would do. Next I grabbed my car keys and bolted, driving straight to a motel on the edge of town. The next morning I returned to find the house in disarray. Furniture was overturned, pictures were ripped from the walls, and the words "you can't run" were scrawled in dirt across the living room floor. I left Whispering Pines that same day, abandoning the house and everything I owned. I didn't care about the money I'd lose or the questions people would ask. I just needed to get away. It's been 6 months now and I've moved to a new town far from the mountains, but sometimes late at night I feel that same oppressive presence, like someone is standing just outside my window watching, and I know it's only a matter of time before the silent watcher finds me again. It all started when I took a job as a night security guard. After struggling to find work in the city, I was desperate for anything that paid the bills. So when the opportunity to guard an abandoned building on the outskirts of town came up, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent and the hours were flexible enough to allow me to continue my job search during the day. The building in question was the old Willow Crest Asylum. It had been shut down decades ago, its reputation tarnished by stories of abuse, neglect, and tragedy. Most people in town avoided it like the plague, claiming it was haunted. I wasn't superstitious, so I dismissed the stories as small-town gossip. The first night on the job I arrived at the asylum just before sunset. The building loomed in the fading light, its towering structure casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The windows were cracked and covered in grime, and the front doors hung slightly ajar, as if the building itself was beckoning me inside. I signed in at the security desk, a tiny station set up in the lobby. My task was simple: walk the perimeter of the building every hour, make sure no one was trespassing, and report anything unusual. Easy enough. I thought the first few hours were uneventful. The building was eerily silent, the only sounds being the occasional creak of old wood and the whistle of the wind through broken windows. I explored the hallways with my flashlight, marveling at how much of the asylum had been left untouched. Old wheelchairs sat abandoned in corners, patient records were scattered across the floors, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. But as the night wore on, the silence began to feel oppressive. I started to notice strange things. Doors that I was sure I had closed were now open. The sound of faint whispers seemed to echo down the hallways, though I could never pinpoint where they were coming from. Around 2, I was doing my rounds on the second floor when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic, tapping sound. It was coming from one of the patient rooms at the end of the hall. My heart raced as I approached the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, save for a rusted bed frame and a few scattered papers. I took a step inside, and that's when I saw it on the wall, scrawled in what looked like ash. Were the words "Help us"? I froze my mind, racing to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it had been written years ago, I told myself, but the handwriting looked fresh. The ash still smudged, as if someone had just finished writing it. I backed out of the room and hurried down the hall, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space. I tried to shake off the unease, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, overlapping and echoing until I couldn't make out individual voices. As I rounded a corner, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, my hands trembling, but the light wouldn't come back on, and then I saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, began to emerge from the shadows. They were dressed in tattered hospital gowns, their faces gaunt and hollow. They moved silently, their eyes fixed on me, with a mixture of despair and anger. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice sounded weak and pitiful in the vast empty hallway. The figures didn't stop. They moved closer, their forms flickering like static on an old TV screen. One of them, a woman with sunken eyes and a skeletal frame, reached out toward me. Her fingers were long and bony, her nails cracked and blackened. "Help us," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices pleading and crying out. I stumbled down a staircase, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell, and burst into the lobby. But the asylum wasn't finished with me yet. The front doors, which had been slightly open when I arrived, were now sealed shut. I pulled at them with all my strength, but they wouldn't budge. The air grew colder and the whispers turned into screams. I turned to see the figures descending the staircase, their forms multiplying. The woman was at the front, her hand still outstretched. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have to free us." I don't know how I cried, tears streaming down my face. She stopped a few feet away from me, her head tilting to the side, as if studying me. "The basement." She said. "It's in the basement." Before I could respond, the figures began to dissolve their forms, fading into the darkness. The lobby fell silent once more and the air grew warm again. I didn't want to go to the basement. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to find a way out and never look back. But something in her voice, something raw and broken, compelled me to stay. I found the door to the basement at the back of the building. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a nearby hook as if someone had left it there for me. The staircase leading down was narrow and steep, the walls lined with peeling paint. The air grew colder with each step and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs was a large open room filled with old equipment, gurns, restraints, and machines. I couldn't begin to identify. In the center of the room was a metal table and above it hung a single flickering bulb. On the table was a box. It was small and made of wood, its surface carved with intricate symbols. I hesitated, my hand hovering over it before finally lifting the lid. Inside were scraps of paper, each one covered in the same scrolled handwriting as the message on the wall. The papers were filled with desperate pleas, stories of patients who had suffered and died in the asylum. Their words were haunting each one, a testament to the horrors they had endured. As I read, the whispers returned softer, this time like a chorus of gratitude. I looked around the room half expecting to see the figures again, but I was alone. When I closed the box, the air grew warm and the oppressive feeling lifted. It was as if the building itself had let out a sigh of relief. I left the asylum that night and never went back. The next day I quit my job and moved to a new town far away from Willow Crest. But sometimes late at night I still hear those whispers faint and distant, and I wonder if I truly set them free or if they'll come looking for me again. The summer my family rented the lake house as one I'll never forget. It wasn't supposed to be terrifying. It was supposed to be an escape, a peaceful retreat where we could bond, relax, and forget the chaos of our lives in the city. My parents had been struggling in their marriage and this vacation was their attempt at fixing things. The lake house was beautiful at first glance. Nestled deep in the woods, it sat on the edge of a pristine lake that mirrored the sky. The house itself was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors, a large stone fireplace and a dock that stretched out into the water. It was secluded, the nearest neighbor over a mile away. That isolation was supposed to be the point. No distractions, no interruptions, just us. We arrived on a warm, sunny afternoon. The house smelled of aged wood and dust, but it had a certain charm that made it feel welcoming. My younger sister, Lily, and I ran through the rooms, picking up our favorites. I chose the one upstairs with a small balcony overlooking the lake. That night, as the sun set, the lake turned a deep inky black. The woods around the house seemed to close in their shadows, stretching and twisting in the moonlight. I stood on the balcony looking out at the still water when I thought I saw something, a ripple like something moving just beneath the surface. I stared at the spot waiting for whatever it was to resurface, but nothing happened. I convinced myself it was a fish or the wind and went to bed. The first strange thing happened. The next morning we woke up to find all the chairs in the kitchen stacked on top of the table. My parents laughed it off, saying it was probably Lily or me playing a prank, but I knew it wasn't. Lily was only 6 and she wouldn't have been able to lift those heavy chairs by herself. As the days passed, more strange things began to happen. At night I would hear soft splashing sounds coming from the lake, as if someone or something was waiting through the water. My dad's watch disappeared, only to turn up days later in the freezer. The air in the house always seemed colder than it should have been, no matter how bright and sunny it was outside. Then there were the whispers. It started with Lily. She came into my room one night, her eyes wide and teary. "Emma," she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "There's a man in my room." I sat up, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? Did you see someone?" She nodded. "He's in the corner. He talks to me at night." I followed her back to her room, turning on every light along the way. Her room was empty. Of course I checked the closet under the bed, even the window. There was no sign of anyone. "It's just your imagination," I told her, tucking her back into bed. But as I left her room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night I heard the whispers for the first time. They were faint, almost inaudible, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I strained to make out the words, but they were too garbled, too distorted. The next morning, Lily refused to leave her room. She sat on her bed, staring at the corner with a blank, terrified expression. "What's wrong, sweetie?" my mom asked, kneeling beside her. "Hugh's mad," Lily whispered. "Who's mad? The man. He doesn't want us here." My mom exchanged a worried glance with my dad, but they brushed it off. As a child's overactive imagination, I knew better. That afternoon I decided to explore the lake. I thought a swim might clear my head and help me shake off the growing unease. The water was cold, much colder than I expected for midsummer. As I swam out toward the middle, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beneath the surface. I turned and swam back to the dock as fast as I could. As I climbed out of the water, I glanced back and froze. There was something in the lake, a face pale and bloated, with hollow black eyes staring up at me from beneath the surface. I screamed, stumbling backward onto the dock. When I looked again, it was gone. I told my parents what I saw, but they didn't believe me. My dad even waded into the water to prove there was nothing there. "It's just the reflections. Playing tricks on you," he said. But I knew what I saw. That night the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. I couldn't sleep, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. Around midnight I heard Lily scream. I bolted out of bed and ran to her room. She was sitting up in bed, pointing at the corner. He's here, she cried. I turned to look, and for a split second I saw him, a man pale and waterlogged. His clothes tattered and dripping. His face was distorted like it had been underwater for too long, and his eyes were empty sockets. Then he was gone. We left the lake house the next morning, cutting our vacation short. My parents didn't say much during the drive home, but I could tell they were shaken. A few weeks later I decided to do some research on the lake house. What I found still haunts me. Decades ago, a man named Jacob Grayson had owned the property. He was a recluse rarely seen in town, and rumors swirled about his strange behavior. One night during a storm, he disappeared. The next morning his body was found in the lake, his face pale and bloated, just like I had seen the locals said. His spirit lingered, angry and vengeful, tormenting anyone who stayed in the house. It's been years since that summer, but I still can't go near a lake without feeling that same sense of dread. I don't know what Jacob wanted, but I do know one thing: he didn't want us there. I've always loved old houses. They have a charm, a history that modern homes lack. So when I found an affordable Victorian-era house for rent, I jumped at the chance to live there. I was starting fresh, newly single, and eager to carve out my own space. The house sat on a quiet street surrounded by tall oaks, whose branches seemed to whisper in the breeze. It was a two-story beauty with ornate woodwork and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the walls. The floors creaked, the stairs groaned, and the air always carried a faint musty smell. But I didn't mind. It was perfect, or so. I thought the first week was uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know the works of the house. There were little things, like the way the pipes groaned when the water ran or how the old radiators hissed at night. It all added to the charm, but then I started noticing something odd. Every time I went upstairs, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just the usual creaky house on ease. It was something deeper, more unsettling. I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the bottom of the stairs, but no one was ever there. One night, as I was heading to bed, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darker than the rest, moving at the base of the stairs. I stopped and stared, my heart pounding hello. I called out, trying to sound brave. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning I woke up to find the kitchen chairs pulled out from the table as if someone had been sitting in them during the night. I distinctly remembered pushing them in before going to bed. Maybe I was sleepwalking, I thought, or maybe I was just tired and forgot. But as the days passed, the occurrences became harder to ignore. Doors I knew I'd closed were open. When I came back into the room, objects moved from their usual places once I found the bathroom faucet running full blast, even though I hadn't touched it, and then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking up or down. I'd rushed to the staircase expecting to find an intruder, but it was always empty. One night I decided to stay up and catch whoever or whatever was causing the disturbances. I sat in the living room, all the lights off. My eyes fixed on the staircase. It was around 2, and when I heard it, the creak of a step followed by another and another. The sound was unmistakable, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No response, and then I saw it, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, moving up the stairs. It had no defined shape, no edges, just a shifting mass that seemed to pulse and web. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. I froze, unable to look away. The shadow stopped halfway up the stairs, and for a moment I thought it turned to look at me, and then it disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called a friend, Sarah, who was into paranormal stuff. She loved ghost stories and had even done a few amateur investigations. I told her what had been happening, and she jumped at the chance to come over and check it out. When she arrived, she brought a digital recorder, an EMF meter, and a bundle of sage. "Let's see what we're dealing with," she said, grinning. We spent the afternoon walking through the house, Sarah asking questions into the recorder while I trailed behind her. The EMF meter didn't pick up much, but the recorder was a different story. When we played back the recordings, there were faint, whispery voices. Most of it was garbled, but one phrase stood out: "Get out." Sarah's grin faded. "Okay, that's creepy," she admitted. She suggested we cleanse the house with sage. So we did. We walked through every room, burning the sage and repeating some kind of blessing Sarah had found online. The air felt lighter afterward, and I dared to hope that whatever was in the house was gone. But that night things escalated. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more insistent. I sat up, clutching the blanket, my heart racing, and then my bedroom door creaked open. There was no one there, just the empty hallway. But I could feel it, the same oppressive presence I'd felt on the stairs. The air grew cold and the faint scent of something rotting filled the room. The shadow appeared in the doorway. It was larger, now more defined, its edges sharp and jagged. It moved into the room, its dark form, swallowing the light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow loomed over me, and for a moment I thought it was going to engulf me, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next morning I packed my things and left. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just wanted to get out. I later learned from a neighbor that the house had a dark history. Decades ago, a man had lived there with his wife and daughter one night in a fit of rage. He killed them both before hanging himself on the staircase case. They say his spirit never left, and neither did theirs. I still think about that house. Sometimes, especially when I hear a creak in the floorboards or a whisper in the dark, I try to convince myself it's nothing, but deep down I know better. Some shadows don't disappear when you turn on the light. When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, a fresh start after a rough breakup and a string of bad luck. The building was old, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, and had a certain charm, with its cracked walls and squeaky wooden floors. The landlord, Mr. Hill, was an older man who seemed harmless enough, though he moved with a nervous energy that made me wonder if he was hiding something. The apartment itself was modest but cozy, a small kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. It was perfect for one person. The only odd thing about it was the silence. The walls were so thick that I couldn't hear a thing from the neighboring units. In a city where you could usually hear every footstep, argument, or blaring TV, the quiet felt unnatural. Still, I wasn't going to complain. Peace and quiet were exactly what I needed. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and tried to make the place feel like home, but by the end of the week I started noticing little things that didn't add up. It began with the smell. Every now and then I'd catch a faint whiff of something foul like rotting meat. It wasn't constant, just occasional bursts of stench that seemed to come from nowhere. I cleaned every inch of the apartment, thinking it might be old food or something in the pipes, but the smell persisted. Then there were the noises. At first I thought they were coming from outside, the occasional thump or scrape, like someone moving furniture, but no one ever seemed to be around. When I checked one night, I heard faint footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. The strange thing was, I lived on the top floor. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, or maybe the wind, but deep down I wasn't so sure. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd. The bathroom mirror had fogged up as if someone had taken a hot shower, but I hadn't used the shower. That day, when I wiped the mirror clean, I froze. There was a word written on the glass, faint but unmistakable: leave. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank or maybe leftover condensation from a previous tenant. But how could it appear so suddenly? When I'd been in the apartment all day, I decided to call Mr. Hill the next morning. He was evasive when I mentioned the mirror. It's an old building. He said strange things happen sometimes, but there's nothing to worry about. His tone suggested otherwise. That night I locked every door and window, determined to shake off the unease. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, like someone was standing in the room watching me. Around 3 a.m. I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, like whispering, but it grew louder. The voices were low, overlapping, as if multiple people were speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, angry, terrified. I turned on the light. The whispers stopped instantly. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing. The next day I decided to do some digging. I went to the local library and searched for any information about the building. It didn't take long to find something. Years ago, the building had been a boarding house. One night a fire broke out, killing several residents. The cause of the fire was never determined, but some people believed it was intentional arson. The article mentioned that most of the victims had been trapped on the top floor. I felt sick that night. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom. I stayed in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, the TV on for background noise. Around midnight the TV shut off on its own. I grabbed the remote and tried to turn it back on, but nothing happened. That's when I heard it, The sound of footsteps coming from the hallway outside my door. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a moment there was silence and then 3 loud knocks. I didn't move. The knocks came again harder. This time, "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and called Mr. Hill to tell him I was leaving. He didn't seem surprised. Before I left, I decided to take one last look around. As I stood in the living room, I felt a sudden chill. The smell of rot was stronger than ever and the air felt thick, oppressive, and then I saw them shadows moving across the walls. Even and though there was nothing to cast them, they weren't human-shaped. More like amorphous blobs shifting and writhing one by one, they moved toward the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. I grabbed my bag and ran. I never went back to that apartment. A few weeks later, I got a call from a friend who had taken an interest in the building's history. She told me she'd found something disturbing, the fire that had killed the residents all those years ago. It wasn't an accident. The landlord at the time had said it deliberately, hoping to collect insurance money. The tenants had been locked inside. I still get chills thinking about that apartment. I'll never know if the shadows I saw were the spirits of those who died in the fire, but one thing is certain, they wanted me out. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories and paranormal tales. Growing up, I was the type to dismiss any supernatural experiences as tricks of the mind or just a result of an over-AC of imagination. But that all changed the day I moved into the apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in the city. The building was the kind of place that had seen better days. The brick facade was chipped and the windows were covered with dust and grime. But it was cheap, and at the time that was all that mattered. I was in my late 20s, living alone after a messy breakup, and I needed a fresh start in a new city. The apartment had a certain charm to it, albeit a decaying one, and the rent was low enough that I could afford it on my own. The first few weeks went by without incident. The landlord, Mr. Gray, was a quiet man who barely ever left his office on the 1st floor. He was kind enough but seemed to have an air of nervousness around him, like he was always waiting for something. The neighbors were mostly quiet too. The woman in 3A, Mr. S. Winthrop, was a reclusive type who rarely left her apartment, and the young couple in 3B were always gone by the time I returned home from work. But it was the man in 2B who stood out to me. He was an older gentleman, probably in his 60s, with white hair and a somewhat frail appearance. I didn't think much of him at first. We exchanged pleasantries when we ran into each other in the hallway. He seemed pleasant, but there was something about his eyes, a coldness to them, that made me uneasy. It wasn't until a few weeks after I moved in that I started noticing the oddities. I first realized something was wrong. When I hadn't seen him around for a few days, it wasn't unusual for people to keep to themselves, but I hadn't heard the faint sound of his television or seen him walking past my door. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Then one evening I was leaving my apartment to grab dinner when I bumped into Mr. S. Winthrop in the hallway. She had a strange vacant look on her face, like she wasn't fully aware of her surroundings. "Excuse me," I said lightly, but she didn't seem to hear me at first. She blinked a few times before looking at me, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Oh, it's you, dear," she said in a raspy voice. "You're looking for him too, aren't you?" "Looking for who?" I asked, confused. "Mr. Williams," she replied, nodding towards 2B. "He's been gone for days, you know. I thought someone would come to check on him." The name hit me like a sudden gust of wind. Mr. Williams, the man I had seen in the hallway so often, hadn't been around for a while. I hadn't thought to check on him, but now I was curious. I told Mr. S. Winthrop I'd look into it and made my way to 2B. When I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I tried again, knocking a little louder, but still nothing. A strange feeling came over me, something like an unsettling pressure in the pit of my stomach. It felt as if the air in the building had thickened, and I suddenly wished I hadn't come. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go to the landlord's office to ask if he had any information about Mr. Williams. Mr. Gray was sitting behind his desk. As always, his hands folded in front of him. When I asked about Mr. Williams, his expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered to the window for a split second. It was subtle, but I caught it. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Williams' hen's not been around for some time," he said, his voice steady but tense. "We've been meaning to look into it, but well, things are complicated. I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's just say Mr. Williams has a history here. It's not something I can go into. If you're concerned, I can send someone to check on him." Mr. Gray offered, clearly eager to change the subject. I didn't feel like pushing him for more information, so I thanked him and left that night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about the look in Mr. Gray's eyes, the way Mr. S. Winthrop had seemed almost too calm about the situation. It felt as though they both were hiding something. But what? Over the next few days I tried to go about my normal routine, but the thoughts of Mr. Williams and his sudden disappearance kept haunting me. I found myself walking past his door several times, hoping for some sign that he was still around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just an eerie silence. Then, a week later, I received an unexpected visit from Mr. S. Winthrop. She knocked on my door late in the evening, her face pale and drawn. There was a wild look in her eyes, and I could tell something was wrong. "Something's happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I think you need to see this." She led me to 2B, her shaky hands gripping the railing as she ascended the stairs. When we arrived, I noticed the door to Mr. Williams' apartment was slightly ajar, just enough for us to peer inside. I hesitated, but Mr. S. Winner pushed the door open with a creak inside. Everything was frozen in time. The apartment was cluttered with books, old furniture, and dusty curtains that fluttered slightly in the breeze coming from the open window. But there was something terribly wrong about the room. The air was thick, with a rancid odor, like something had been left to rot for far too long, and then I saw it sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, Mr. Williams, but he was different. Now his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and his skin had taken on a grayish hue. He looked like he had been dead for days, maybe longer, but his body was still too lifelike. Mr. S. Winthrop started crying, muttering something under her breath. I stood there, frozen, unable to look away from Mr. Williams' lifeless figure. Then, as if in response to my thoughts, a low, creaking noise came from the back of the room. I turned just in time to see something move. No, someone emerging from the shadows. It was a man tall, thin and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a twisted smile on his face. He was wearing clothes that looked old, like something from the 1940s. His skin was a sickly shade of pale and his hair hung in matted clumps around his face. He stepped forward, his feet dragging across the floor, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "This is the one," the man said in a raspy voice, his eyes locking onto mine. "He's been waiting for you." I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick with dread and I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man reached out with a bony hand, his fingers brushing against my arm, and everything went black. The next thing I remember, I was sitting in my apartment drenched in sweat. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking. I had no idea how I got back, but I knew one thing for sure. I had seen something that night, something I could never unsee. The man, the figure in 2B, whatever he was still out there. I never spoke to Mr. S. Winthrop again, and I left the apartment the next day, breaking my lease. The landlord, Mr. Gray, was nowhere to be found, and I later learned the building was condemned and slated for demolition. The whole place was torn down not long after, and no one ever spoke of Mr. Williams or the man in the shadows again to this day. I can't help but wonder what happened to him or to the others in that building. But I know one thing for sure: there are some things that are better left forgotten. I used to think I was immune to fear. I grew up in a small town, and as a kid I often spent my days exploring the woods, hiking alone and testing my limits. My friends and family would always joke that I was the bravest one of the group. Fear, I believed, was just something that happened to other people. That was, of course, until I moved into my first real apartment. It was a charming little place in an old building tucked away on the outskirts of the city. The price was affordable and everything about it screamed quaint, from the creaky wooden floors to the vintage wallpaper that lined the hallways. It had character and, although I had heard a few rumors about the building's past, I brushed them off as typical city gossip. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the quiet solitude. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough. I would occasionally see Mr. S. Henderson in the hallway, an elderly woman with a soft smile and a can, but other than that, I didn't interact much with the others. It was during the second week that things started to change. I woke up one morning to a strange noise. It wasn't a loud bang or anything disruptive. It was more like the sound of someone gently tapping on the wall next to my bed, soft, rhythmic, like fingers drumming in a slow, deliberate pattern. At first I figured it was just the old pipes or the building settling. The structure was old after all, and these types of noises were common in buildings like mine. But as the tapping continued throughout the day, I began to feel a sense of unease. It wasn't that the noise was particularly loud, it was the fact that it was consistent. It had a pattern, a strange rhythm that made it feel as though someone or something was deliberately trying to get my attention. The tapping continued for days. Each morning I would wake up to the soft, almost inaudible rhythm, and each night it would lull me into an uneasy sleep. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the sounds of an old building. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, the tapping never stopped. Then, one night the tapping changed. It was no longer a rhythmic beat. Instead, the noise became whispering. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. When I heard it, it started as a faint murmur, barely audible, as if someone was standing just outside my door and speaking in hushed tones. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Come closer," the voice whispered so softly I almost thought I imagined it, but then it repeated, this time louder and clearer, "Come closer, we are waiting." I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the wall, the source of the whispers, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the apartment was empty. There was no one in the hallway, no one outside my door, just the eerie whispering that seemed to seep from the very walls around me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent hours pacing the apartment, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But the whispering continued. The same words, the same soft voice calling me closer. It was impossible to ignore, and with each passing hour I felt more and more as though something was closing in on me. The next day I went to the landlord, Mr. Thompson, and asked if he had ever heard of any unusual occurrences in the building. He was an older man with a graying beard and thick glasses, and he always seemed somewhat distracted. But when I mentioned the tapping and whispering, his face darkened. "Listen, kid," he said, lowering his voice. "You're not the first person to mention strange noises, but I don't know what you're talking about and I don't think you should go digging for answers." His tone was cold and I could tell he wasn't being entirely honest, but I let it go thinking. Maybe I was overreacting. After all, he was the landlord. If there was something wrong with the building, surely he would know. That night the whispers returned, but this time they were louder. The voice seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, the very floors beneath me. It was as though the building itself was alive, breathing in the dark and beckoning me to come closer, come closer. The voice repeated, "You know you want to." I tried to shut it out, to block it out with music or TV, but nothing worked. The whispers continued growing more insistent until they were all I could hear. It was as if they were inside my head, scratching at the edges of my thoughts, making it impossible to think of anything else. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept in days and my mind was beginning to unravel. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Something was wrong with that building, something I couldn't explain. But I had to find out what. I started researching the building's history, hoping to uncover some answers. What I found shocked me. The building was built in the 1920s and for years it had been home to a series of tenants, most of whom had moved out unexpectedly, often without giving proper notice. The reports from previous residents were vague, but there were consistent mentions of strange sounds and feelings of being watched. Some tenants even claimed they had heard whispers at night calling their names. But it wasn't just the tenants who had experienced these strange occurrences. There were reports of similar events going back decades, whispers tapping strange noises that seemed to come from nowhere. There was even mention of a disappearing tenant, a man who had lived in the building in the 1940s, who was never seen again. After a particularly loud disturbance one night, his name had been erased from all records, as if he had never existed. As I dug deeper, I discovered that the building had once been a boarding house and a fire had broken out on the top floor. In the late 1800s, several people had perished in the flames. Their bodies never found. The fire had been ruled accidental, but rumors persisted that it had been deliberately set. And then I found it the most chilling detail of all. In the building's early days, a woman had died in the apartment I was now living in. Her name was Margaret Hastings, and she was found dead in her bed one night with a look of sheer terror frozen on her face. No cause of death could be determined, but witnesses reported hearing whispers coming from the walls before her death. The more I read, the more I realized that the whispers weren't just pigments of my imagination. They had been a part of the building's history for years, and whatever was causing them seemed to be linked to the tragic events that had unfolded here. That night I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay there any longer. The apartment, the whispers, the tapping, it was all too much. As I stood in the hallway ready to leave, I heard it one last time. Come closer. I didn't turn around, I just ran. I never went back to that building. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, was gone the next time I tried to contact him, and the apartment was listed as unavailable. I don't know what happened to it or to the tenants who lived there after me, but I'll never forget the whispers. They're still with me, lurking in the back of my mind. I hear them sometimes in the silence of the night. I don't know what they want or why they chose me, but one thing is certain, I will never be able to escape the sound of those whispers. And sometimes, just sometimes, I can still hear them calling, beckoning me back to the walls where it all began. Come closer. It was the kind of night that made you feel like the world was just a little off balance. It had rained all day and the streets were slick, reflecting the neon lights that flickered from the convenience stores and bars. I was on my way home from work, exhausted and irritable, and there wasn't a soul in sight. As I waited for the bus, the chill in the air wrapped itself around me like a damp blanket, and I was already regretting not taking the cab home. The bus stop was a small run-down shelter, illuminated by a flickering light above. As I stood there listening to the sound of distant thunder rumbling, I glanced down the street waiting for the familiar headlights of the bus to appear, but nothing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I checked my watch. It was nearly midnight. The city wasn't usually this quiet at this time. The streets were usually filled with the hustle and bustle of late-night workers drunk stumbling home in the hum of activity. But tonight the streets were empty, almost too empty. I thought about calling a cab, but before I could, the headlights of the bus finally appeared around the corner. It wasn't the usual bus I took, though. This one was old, much older than the ones that usually pass through this route. The paint was chipped, the windows were cracked, and it had a strange, almost eerie hum. As it approached, I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't like me to be scared of something so trivial, but something about this bus. Its slow, deliberate approach felt wrong. However, the alternative was waiting in the cold for a cab that could take who knows how long to get to me. So I made the decision to board. The doors opened with a soft hiss and the driver, a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes, looked up at me. "Where to?" he asked, his voice low and monotone. Just down to Pine and 7th. I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I handed him my fare and stepped inside, feeling the bus sway slightly as the doors closed behind me. The interior of the bus was dimly lit, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across the seats. It was nearly empty, save for one person sitting near the back, a woman who seemed to be staring out the window. I took a seat near the middle, hoping I wasn't being too paranoid. The bus started moving and we traveled in silence, the hum of the engine filling the quiet spaces between us. As the bus rumbled along, I noticed that the woman who had been sitting near the back was now standing, swaying slightly as though the motion of the bus was too much for her to handle. She wore a long coat that looked far too heavy for the weather, and her hair, dark and unkempt, fell around her face like a curtain. I glanced at her briefly, and for some reason I felt an odd chill run down my spine. Something about her seemed off. She wasn't acting like the typical late-night commuter. She didn't seem aware of anything around her. She simply stared ahead with a vacant, unfocused look in her eyes. I tried to shake off the feeling and turned my attention to the outside, watching the buildings blur by in the rain-soaked night, but when I looked back toward her, I noticed something strange. She was no longer standing. She was sitting in the seat across from me, but she was facing me. Her eyes locked on mine. I froze. Her eyes were dark hollow, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way she stared. I quickly turned away, my heart suddenly racing in my chest. The bus seemed to be taking longer than usual to reach my stop. I didn't remember passing the usual landmarks. There were no familiar intersections, no street signs that I recognized. The windows were fogging up, obscuring my view of the world outside and the driver. He hadn't said a word since I boarded, his eyes fixed on the road, his hands stiff on the wheel. As the minutes dragged on, I began to feel a sense of dread creeping up my spine. There was something about the woman's presence that was unnerving, and the silence that filled the bus was starting to make me feel trapped, as though I couldn't escape. Suddenly the bus lurched to a stop. The sudden movement threw me forward in my seat, and I quickly grabbed the armrest to steady myself. When I looked up, I realized we weren't at my stop. In fact, we were nowhere near it. The woman was standing again, and now she was directly in front of me. Her face was inches from mine, her cold breath against my cheek. "You're not going to make it out of here," she whispered. I pulled back instinctively, but before I could speak, the bus jerked again and started moving in the opposite direction. The woman didn't seem to notice. She simply stared at me with those hollow eyes, her lips curling into a twisted smile. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I stood up abruptly, but the bus was still moving and it seemed to be traveling through an endless stretch of empty roads. The city outside had disappeared entirely. There was nothing but darkness, no streetlights, no signs, no landmarks. It was as though we were driving through a vast empty void. I looked toward the front of the bus, my breath catching in my throat. The driver's face was now obscured in shadow. His head tilted slightly as if listening to something, but there was no sound, only the eerie hum of the bus's engine and the occasional sound of rain tapping on the windows. "Excuse me," I called, but my voice was weak and it didn't seem to reach him. I moved toward the front, my footsteps heavy against the floor, but just as I reached the driver's seat, I froze. The seat was empty. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what I was seeing. There was no driver, there was no one at the wheel. The bus began to slow down. I could feel the tension in the air, the sense of something terrible approaching. I turned around my eyes, searching the dark corners of the bus. The woman was gone, but the bus wasn't stopping, and then I heard it, a faint sound, like someone whispering my name. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Where am I?" I whispered to myself, my voice shaky. The bus continued to move the city outside, still a blur, the rain tapping against the windows like a quiet, relentless drumbeat. It seemed like hours passed before the bus finally came to a stop, this time with a screeching halt that rattled my bones. I glanced out the window, but all I saw was darkness. I stood there paralyzed, staring at the blackness outside, and then I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure seemed to be waiting for me. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I ran off the bus as fast as I could, not caring where I was not caring. What was out there in the darkness? I just had to get away from that place, from the bus, from the empty streets, from the driver, who had never been real. The moment my feet hit the pavement, I glanced over my shoulder. The bus was gone, but I was not alone. From the corner of my eye, I saw her standing at the bus stop watching me. She smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine, and I knew then, with every fiber of my being, that I had just been the last passenger. I never took that bus again. It was a few months after I graduated college and I had just moved into a small apartment in the city. Like most people, I was just trying to get my life together, find a decent job, pay my bills and get through each day without too much drama. The apartment was perfect for my budget, small but clean, with a good view and located in a quiet neighborhood. It was everything I needed. There was only one thing about it that seemed off the roommate. I found the apartment through a listing on a popular website. It was a shared unit and the price was reasonable for the area. The person I would be sharing the apartment with, a guy named Jordan, seemed friendly enough over email. He was a recent college graduate, just like me, and said he worked in the city doing something in finance, nothing too exciting. But he promised that we'd both have our own space and that the apartment was relatively quiet. When I first moved in, everything seemed fine. The apartment was as advertised and Jordan, who I met briefly on the day I moved in, seemed like a regular guy. He was a little quieter than most people I'd met, but not in a strange way, just more of an introvert, I assumed. But there was one thing that bothered me. Jordan was always in his room for the first few weeks. It didn't seem like a big deal. We'd run into each other occasionally. He'd come out for a few minutes to grab something from the fridge or use the bathroom. But as time went on, I began to notice something odd. I almost never saw him leave his room. It didn't seem like he went to work either. Every time I looked out into the living room or checked the front door, his shoes were still by the hallway. His door was always closed. At first I brushed it off. Maybe he was working long hours, or maybe he was just a homebody. But as the days passed, I started to feel like something wasn't quite right. The apartment was always eerily quiet and Jordan never had friends over. It was like living alone, but with the faint presence of someone who might as well have been invisible. The first time I really started to get worried was one night when I couldn't sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. and there was a faint noise coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was just the house settling or some small sound from the pipes, but then I heard it again, like soft shuffling steps. I lay in bed listening for a moment, then got up. I crept into the hallway, where I could hear the faint sounds of movement coming from Jordan's room. His door was slightly ajar, and as I approached I noticed the light under the door was still on. The odd thing, though, was that Jordan's shadow wasn't visible beneath the crack in the door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should knock, but then I heard the sound again, almost like a faint humming. It was the sort of sound a person makes when they're pacing or thinking, but what struck me as odd was that it didn't sound like he was moving around the room. It was almost as if he was standing perfectly, still making a soft, rhythmic sound with his mouth. I knocked lightly, calling out his name. No response. I knocked harder, louder this time, and still nothing. Something about the whole situation made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to let it go for the night, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. I went back to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing. I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had just witnessed something strange. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was living with a stranger, even though I technically wasn't. The next few days passed uneventfully, but that night the noises started again. I had just settled into bed and I was half asleep when I heard it, a soft, gentle tapping sound. It was coming from the hallway again. This time I was more awake and I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps. It was light and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. This time I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone, opened the door and stood there listening. The hallway was empty, but the faint sound of footsteps seemed to be moving back and forth near the living room. "Jordan," I called a little louder this time. There was no response. I stepped out into the hallway and walked cautiously toward his room. As I got closer, I could see that his door was open, but it wasn't the same as before. The light from his room wasn't on and the space beyond the door was pitch black. My pulse quickened. I pushed the door open slightly, just enough to peer inside. The room was empty. It was exactly as I remembered it. Nothing was out of place, no unusual sounds, no strange odors, just an ordinary empty room. But as I stood there, a strange chill washed over me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an undeniable presence, like something was watching me from the darkness. I closed the door quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. Something felt wrong, really wrong. The next day I decided to confront Jordan. When I knocked on his door, I was met with silence. I knocked again, a little harder this time, but no answer. I felt a wave of unease sweep over me. At this point I was starting to question my own sanity. What was going on with Jordan? Why was he never around, and why was there such an eerie feeling in the apartment? The unease lingered for a few more days, and I decided I needed a break. I reached out to a few friends and made plans to stay with one of them for a weekend just to clear my head and get away from the apartment. It seemed like the best solution at the time, so I packed a bag and left, hoping that the space and time away would help me reset. When I came back after the weekend, I was immediately struck by how quiet the apartment was. It felt different. Somehow. The air felt thick, like it was weighed down with something unsaid, something unspoken, and then I saw it. As I walked toward my room, I noticed the door to Jordan's room was slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. I pushed the door open and the room was completely empty. No furniture, no personal items. It was as if he had never lived there at all. I stood there, frozen in place. There was no trace of him, no belongings, nothing to indicate he had ever been there. His clothes were gone, his laptop, everything. It was like he had disappeared. Without a trace. Panic set in. I rushed into the living room, checking every nook and cranny. There was no sign of Jordan anywhere. Called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting him, but there was no response. By this point, I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I checked the lease agreement and his name was still listed as a roommate. But why was everything gone? That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the door to Jordan's room, trying to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, the soft tapping. It came from behind the closed door of Jordan's empty room. Slowly I rose to my feet, walking cautiously toward it. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Was someone still here? What had happened to Jordan? I opened the door and the tapping stopped inside the room. In the darkness, I could just make out a faint outline of something or someone. But before I could take another step, the light flickered on, and there, sitting on the floor in the center of the room, was Jordan. His eyes wide, his expression vacant, and in his hands he held a small piece of paper. It was covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to be moving, shifting before my eyes. "You shouldn't have left," he whispered, his voice hollow, barely a sound. "What is this? What happened to you?" I gasped, but Jordan simply smiled. "You're never leaving," he murmured, and with that the room went dark again. That was the last time I ever saw Jordan, and to this day I'm not sure what happened to him, but every now and then, when I sit in that apartment alone, I hear the tapping, soft, rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth, always in the dark, always waiting, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear his voice whispering from behind that closed door. "You're never leaving." It was one of those chilly autumn evenings when the wind howls outside and the scent of damp leaves fills the air. I had just returned home from a long day at work, exhausted and craving the peace and quiet of my apartment. The apartment was small but comfortable, 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room and a tiny kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I had moved to this city for a fresh start, hoping that living alone would help me clear my head after a difficult few years. The first few weeks in the apartment were uneventful. I settled into a routine work, dinner, reading, and a little bit of online shopping when I had the energy. But there was something about the apartment that gave me an odd sense of unease. It wasn't overtly creepy. There were no strange sounds or shadows lurking in the corners, but there was this quiet, unshakable feeling that something wasn't quite right. I dismissed it as paranoia, telling myself that I was just adjusting to living alone one evening. Just a few weeks after I moved in, I returned home later than usual. The sun had already set and the sky was dark, with the promise of rain. As I fumbled for my keys outside the front door, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I always made sure to double-check the lock, but tonight the door was open just enough to slip my fingers through. My heart rate quickened as I pushed the door open. Slowly, my mind racing. Had someone broken in? I entered cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was inside, but the apartment was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rattle of rain against the windows. I glanced around, checking each room. Everything was in place. Nothing appeared to be out of order. But then I noticed something odd. The light in the hallway was on. I always left that light off, preferring the dim glow of a single lamp in the living room. I walked down the hallway to turn it off, but as I reached for the switch, something stopped me. There was a faint scent in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unfamiliar. It smelled like a mixture of old wood and something herbal. It lingered in the air, almost like someone had been standing in the hallway recently. I turned off the light and headed back into the living room. That's when I saw it. On the coffee table there was a small envelope carefully placed in the center. The envelope wasn't there. When I left that morning, my stomach dropped as I walked over to it, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The envelope was plain, no return address, no markings, just an ordinary white envelope with a wax seal. I peeled it open and pulled out the letter. Inside, it read, "We have been watching you. The door is always open. We will see you soon." I froze. The letter seemed to pulse with a cold energy and my mind raced to make sense of it. Who would send such a message? I did have any enemies. I had barely settled into the city and the idea that someone had been watching me, someone had been in my apartment, sent chills down my spine. The hours that followed were filled with an eerie sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking in the shadows watching my every move. I checked all the locks on the windows and doors again, double-checked my phone to make sure there were no strange messages, but nothing gave me any comfort. The letter was still lying on the coffee table, the cryptic message staring back at me. I tried to go to bed, hoping that I would somehow feel better by morning, but sleep didn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. The apartment, which had always felt like a safe haven, now felt like a cage. As the night wore on, I began to hear soft noises, footsteps, but when I listened closely, the sounds didn't come from outside my apartment. They seemed to be coming from inside. I convinced myself it was the building's plumbing or the house settling, but my instincts told me otherwise. The next day I went to work trying to put the strange events behind me, but that night, as I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. My apartment was quieter than usual, and as I entered the living room I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I glanced around my eyes, searching every corner, but there was no one there. Then I noticed it. The envelope was gone. I looked everywhere for it. I checked the coffee table, the kitchen counter, and even the bathroom, but it was as if the letter had vanished into thin air. I had a clear memory of leaving it on the table, but now it was gone. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Had I imagined it, or had someone come into my apartment again and taken it? That night the sounds returned softer, this time almost like whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them like a faint vibration in the air, a presence that had taken up residence in my home. The whispers seemed to come from the hallway again, but this time I didn't dare to investigate. I stayed in my room, locking the door behind me, too scared to move. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease. Every time I left or returned home, I would check the door, but it was always locked. The hallway light was still off, but there was a constant feeling of being watched, a presence I couldn't escape. I began to dread returning to my apartment, knowing that something was waiting for me, something I couldn't see but could feel. Then, one evening, when I was sitting on the couch reading a book, I heard the soft sound of footsteps again, this time that they were louder, more distinct. They were coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, but the living room was empty. No one was there. My heart pounded as I rose from the couch, my mind racing with terror. The footsteps had been too real, too close, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I walked cautiously toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I saw it. The hallway door, the one I always left closed, was slightly ajar, and standing in the doorway was a figure. It was a man tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned coat, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't speak. He just stood there watching me, his presence almost palpable. My body froze, unable to move. The man remained still, his dark eyes locking with mine, and then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. The door slammed shut with a loud bang, shaking the entire apartment. I stood there paralyzed with fear, unsure of what I had just seen that night. I packed a bag and left the apartment for good. I couldn't explain what had happened or what I had seen, but I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer safe there. The man, whoever he was, had made it clear that I was never truly alone. Something about the apartment, the place I had called home, had become a trap. I never went back. I moved out the very next day and never looked back to this day. I wonder if I was just imagining things or if something truly was watching me all those months. All I know is that the apartment remains empty, and I will never forget the feeling of those cold, unseen eyes always waiting. It was my first year living alone in the city, and I had found a cozy little apartment in an old building with creaky floors and tall, narrow windows. The building had charm, but there was something about it that felt off. Perhaps it was the dim lighting in the hallways or the strange noises that came from the walls at night. Still, I had no real reason to be afraid. After all, it was a building like any other, and I was just happy to have a place of my own. My apartment was on the second floor, right next to an apartment that had been vacant for as long as I had been living there. The building's landlord had told me that the previous tenants had moved out suddenly and that no one had rented the place. Since I thought it was a little odd, but there was nothing about it that screamed danger. I mostly kept to myself, as did the few other tenants I'd met at first. My life in the apartment was peaceful, but after a few months something started to happen, something that made me question my sanity. It began with strange noises at night while I was trying to fall asleep. I would hear footsteps from the apartment next door, but the odd part was that the apartment was supposed to be empty. I wasn't sure if the landlord had let someone in, but every time I checked no one was there. The footsteps would continue, almost as if someone were walking back and forth across the floor, but I would hear no voices, no doors opening or closing, just the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, the walls creaking, or my mind playing tricks on me, but then it started getting worse. I began hearing more distinct sounds, scratching noises. They seemed to come from the walls. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to a faint scratching sound, almost like something or someone was trying to get through the wall. It would last for minutes, long enough for me to get out of bed and press my ear against the wall, but by the time I did, the sound would stop, my heart would pound in my chest, and I would retreat to my bed too scared to go further. I knew I was alone, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. One evening, after a particularly unsettling night of noises, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I'd had enough of the mystery, and I was determined to find out who or what was making the noises in the next apartment. I went to the landlord and asked if anyone had recently moved into the vacant apartment next door. She looked at me with a puzzled expression, shaking her head. No, she said, the apartment has been empty for years. No one's been in there. Her response didn't help much, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I returned to my apartment that evening with a strange sense of dread hanging over me. As I sat on the couch trying to read, I heard it again, the slow, methodical footsteps from the apartment next door. It was then that I decided to investigate. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an overwhelming need to know the truth. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but something inside me told me that I was not just hearing things. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way into the hallway. I carefully approached the door to the vacant apartment. My breath shallow and heart racing. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but I still felt the tension in the air. The hallway light flickered above me, casting long shadows on the walls, reached the door to the next apartment and gently turned the handle. To my surprise, it was unlocked. My pull quickened and I hesitated for a moment, torn between fear and curiosity. But I had come this far and there was no turning back. Now I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The apartment was dark, but I could see a faint outline of furniture through the shadows. It was sparse, just a few pieces, an old couch, a table, and a few chairs. It didn't look like anyone had lived there recently, but there was something off about it. It felt wrong. The air was thick, as if something had been lingering there for far too long. I stepped further into the apartment, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I made my way to the hallway, but there was no sign of anyone, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. But as I reached the end of the hallway, something caught my eye. On the floor near the door that led to the bedroom was a small pile of dust. It wasn't unusual for an abandoned apartment to have some dust, but this dust looked different. It was disturbed, as if something had recently moved across the floor. My breath hitched as I knelt down to examine it, and that's when I saw it, a series of faint, barely noticeable scratches on the floor leading toward the bedroom door. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly stood up. There was someone else in the apartment. I knew it now, but the question was who and what were they doing here? I pushed open the bedroom door cautiously, the room dark, and still I shone my flashlight around, scanning every corner of the room. The bed was undisturbed, the sheets perfectly in place, but as I moved my flashlight across the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the room, behind the door, was a small figure. It was hunched over its back to me, its face hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I was seeing things, but then slowly the figure turned to face me. It was a man. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though he hadn't blinked in years. His hair was long and matted, hanging in clumps around his face. He didn't move, but his eyes never left mine. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. This man, this creature, wasn't supposed to be here. This apartment had been vacant for years, but there he was staring at me from the corner of the room. His mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he gave me a faint, twisted smile, his lips curling at the edges, as if he were savoring my fear. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't obey. The man took a step toward me and I stumbled backward, almost falling over the bed. In a panic, I turned and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest and I couldn't catch my breath. I sprinted back to my own apartment, locked the door and bolted every window and door. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The image of that man, the look in his eyes, that horrible smile, haunted me. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The next morning I packed up my things and left. I didn't even tell the landlord why I was leaving. I just needed to get out. I didn't care where I went, just as long as it wasn't there to this day. I still don't know who that man was or why he was in the apartment. But I know one thing for sure, I'm never going back to that building. Some things are better left forgotten. It was an unusually quiet night, the kind where everything seemed still as if the world had paused. For a moment. The house creaked, the trees outside swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of crickets from the yard. For some reason, this stillness unsettled me. I had just moved into my new home, a small weathered cottage at the edge of town, and despite the house being cozy and charming, there was an unease that clung to the place like a lingering presence that never quite left. I had gotten the house for a good price. It was older, yes, but it had character, high ceilings, a fireplace in the living room and a little garden in the back. When I first saw it, I thought it was perfect, the kind of peaceful place that could help me get away from the chaos of the city. But after the first few days things began to feel off. Small things. At first, the lights flickering, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, the cold drafts in rooms that had no windows open. I chalked it all up to the house being old and in need of maintenance. I was sitting in the living room one evening reading a book. When the clock on the wall struck midnight, the house was dark, except for the warm glow of the lamp beside me. I had just turned a page. When I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps outside my front door, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too human, slow, measured, like someone walking in the quiet of the night, fully aware of each step. They took my breath caught in my throat. I had no visitors scheduled and I hadn't heard anyone approach the house. My first instinct was to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sound was getting louder, closer. I stood up, slowly trying not to make a sound, and walked toward the door. The footsteps had stopped. A silence filled the air, thick and oppressive. I stood by the door for a moment listening, but nothing more came. I held my breath, debating whether to open the door and look outside, but something deep inside me told me not to. I hesitated for a moment before retreating to the living room. Maybe it was a late-night passerby, or maybe I was just being paranoid. I tried to shake the unease that had settled over me and returned to my chair, though the sense of being watched never fully left. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. I kept my windows locked, my curtains drawn and my phone by my side, but the fear wouldn't leave me. What had I heard? Who had been walking outside my door in the dead of night the next day? I tried to put it out of my mind, but it wasn't easy. I went about my day running errands, tidying up the house, but the feeling of being on edge lingered. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind me or hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the floorboards. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would offer some escape from the anxiety that had begun to weigh on me. I brushed my teeth, turned off the lights and slipped under the covers. The house was quiet again and for a moment I felt calm. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time it was coming from inside the house. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing just outside my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, half expecting it to swing open at any moment, but it remained still the wood, smooth and undisturbed. I sat there, frozen, not knowing what to do. The footsteps continued growing louder with each passing moment, until it felt as though whoever was outside my room was right there inches away. I wanted to call out to ask who was there, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to figure out how anyone could have entered the house. I had locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. No one had a key, so how? And then the door creaked open. I jumped back in fright, my heart leaping into my throat. I watched in horror as the door opened, slowly, inch by inch, revealing the dark hallway outside. My breath came in shallow gasps as I waited for something, anything, to appear in the doorway. But there was nothing, no figure, no shadow, nothing at all. The room was eerily silent. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't move, too scared to breathe, too terrified to even blink. My mind screamed at me to run to get out of the house, but my body refused to obey. Then, just as quickly as it had opened, the door slammed shut. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I had been holding for a moment. I simply sat there staring at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was as though the house itself had decided to play some cruel trick on me. I had to be imagining things. There was no way that had really happened, but deep down I knew it hadn't been a trick. The next few days were a blur of unease and fear. I tried to act normal, to go about my routine as though nothing had changed. But every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of my eye sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was always just behind me, always watching. Then one night I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every sound and peering into every dark corner. I had to confront whatever was haunting my house, whatever had been walking the halls at night. I waited until the house was completely silent, the air heavy, with anticipation. When I was certain that no one was around, I took a deep breath and made my way to the basement. I had never bothered to go down there before, but now it felt like the only place to find answers. The basement door creaked open and I descended into the darkness, flashlight in hand. The stairs were narrow and steep and the air down there was thick, with dust and the scent of mildew. I shone the flashlight around the room, scanning the shelves and crates for anything unusual. Everything appeared normal: old boxes, a few forgotten items from previous tenants. But then I saw it at the far corner of the basement, near the back wall, was a door. It wasn't a door to a room. It was more like a small cupboard set into the wall, hidden behind some old furniture. My heart raced as I walked toward it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, like it had always been there, waiting for me. I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. Inside was a small cramped space, just large enough to fit a person. There was nothing in it, no furniture, no storage, just cold, damp stone walls. But at the far end, near the back of the tiny space, there was something scribbled on the wall, faint but visible in the beam of my flashlight. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words scrawled in what looked like charcoal I never left. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the air around me seemed to grow colder. The footsteps, the door opening on its own, the sense of being watched, all of it made sense. Now I wasn't alone in this house, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be again. It was the dead of night when I first heard it. The sound was faint at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks, my heart thumping in my chest. I had just stepped outside to take in the crisp evening air after a long day of work, the sky above, dotted with stars. The house I had rented for the weekend sat on the edge of a forest isolated from the rest of civilization, and I was beginning to appreciate the peace and quiet that came with it. But that sound, it was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was as though someone was calling out to me, soft and urgent, a voice that barely carried over the rustling leaves. I stood there in the darkness, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't a voice I recognized, nor could I tell if it was human or something else entirely. It didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be around, at least not for miles. I told myself it was just an animal, a bird maybe, or some nocturnal creature, and tried to push the feeling of unease from my mind. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The sound of the voice, faint and distant, came again, closer now. This time there was no denying it. It was a voice, and it was calling my name, Rebecca. The chill that ran down my spine was immediate and uncontrollable. My name spoken in the dark from somewhere deep within the woods. I turned around to look toward the house, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing, no one. The lights in the house flickered behind me, casting long shadows across the yard. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark silhouette of the trees ahead. Rebecca, the voice was louder, now more disdain, in and unmistakably coming from the woods. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my breath shallow as I struggled to process what was happening. I should have turned back, gone inside, locked the door and called someone, but there was something in that voice, a pull, an irresistible curiosity that made me step toward the trees, my feet carrying me forward, despite the rational part of my mind screaming at me to stop. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of branches overhead. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the trees loomed around me like silent sentinels, their twisted forms reaching out in all directions, their shadows stretching long and eerie across the forest floor. The voice, though now muffled by the distance, continued to call my name, Rebecca. I felt dizzy, disoriented, my hands trembled, and I instinctively grabbed onto the nearest tree to steady myself. The darkness felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Each step I took seemed to draw me further into the heart of the forest, further away from safety. The voice had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was as if the world had grown deathly. Still, no crickets, no wind, nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. It felt wrong. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the woods just beyond my line of sight, a faint rustling like footsteps, or something far heavier moving through the underbrush. I froze in place, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was out there, hiding in the shadows, watching me. For what felt like an eternity. I stood in the pitch blackness, barely daring to breathe. The rustling stopped and a new, far more unsettling sound took its place, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of an animal deep in the forest, a predator stalking its prey. I wanted to turn back, run, get as far away from this place as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. Suddenly the growl stopped and the voice returned, closer than before. Rebecca, it was right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The forest stood still, its towering trees casting long, dark shadows on the ground. I turned again, looking in every direction. But there was no sign of anyone or anything watching me. But then, in the far distance, I saw it, a figure barely visible through the trees, standing at the edge of the clearing. At first it was just a shadow, but as I stared it became clearer, tall, thin, with long flowing dark hair that seemed to move of its own accord. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there staring at me. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unnerving, fixed on me. I took a step back, heart pounding, terror flooding through my veins. My instincts screamed at me to run, to flee, but my legs felt like lead. The figure didn't seem to be moving toward me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. Waiting for me to come closer, waiting for me to step into the clearing where it stood. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the weight of the gaze from the figure in the wood seemed to pull at my very soul. I didn't know how long I stood there, trapped in the grip of fear, but eventually something changed. The figure, whatever it was, began to move slowly. It started to step toward me, each footfall, heavy and deliberate. My body screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off it, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure stopped. It was mere feet away from me. Now its presence suffocating. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was gone, lost somewhere in the knot, a fear that had taken root in my chest. The figure raised one hand, long fingers extending toward me, its face still hidden in shadow, and then it spoke. "Come with me," it whispered. The voice was soft, almost sweet, but laced with something dark, something ancient. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as it moved closer, its fingers brushing the edge of my sleeve. The coldness of its touch seeped through the fabric of my shirt, sending a shiver down my spine. "Come with me, Rebecca." It repeated, its voice, growing more insistent. "We've been waiting for you." Suddenly, I broke free from my stupor. I tore myself away from the figure, stumbling back as fast as I could. The world around me spun, and I could barely focus on anything except the need to escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the house, not daring to look back, but knowing deep down that something was still following me. The trees seemed to close in on me, the branches grabbing at my clothes. As I ran, my legs burned. My heart raced, but I didn't stop until I was back at the front door of the cottage, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock it. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolted the lock and collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The house was quiet once more, but the air felt wrong. It felt like something was still out there, still watching me. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified to close my eyes in the stillness. I could still hear the voice echoing in my mind. "Come with me, Rebecca," and even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I can still see that figure in the woods. Its cold, seen gaze fixed on me, waiting. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to paranormal stuff. I've grown up around people who believe in ghosts, curses and things that go bump in the night, but I was always too logical to buy into any of it. That was until one night a few years ago, when something happened that I couldn't explain away, no matter how hard I tried. It was the middle of winter and I had just moved into a new apartment. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom in a building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The walls were thin, the plumbing old and the lights flickered sometimes, but I didn't mind. I liked the isolation it offered. I worked long hours, so I didn't spend much time there during the day. But at night, after a long shift, I would return to my little sanctuary and just collapse onto the couch, grateful for the peace and quiet I had been living there for a month. When it started, it was subtle at first, just the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I'd catch myself glancing at the hallway mirror, always seeing a quick dark shadow darting across the glass. When I turned to look, there would be nothing, just my reflection. Tired and disheveled from a long day, I figured it was just the way the dim light hit the surface, or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me from lack of sleep. But over time it started to get worse. One night I came home late after work, the chill of the winter air following me inside. As I closed the door behind me, I tossed my coat over the chair and was about to head into the kitchen when I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the reflection. For a split second I thought I saw a figure standing behind me, a shadowy shape, just out of my direct line of sight. I whipped around, my heart racing. There was no one there. I turned back to the mirror, looking at my own face in the dim light, trying to reassure myself that I was just tired, that I had imagined it. But something felt off. My reflection seemed different. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small shift. My eyes looked darker, more hollow, and the way my lips twitched seemed unnatural. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, trying to shake it off. I moved into the kitchen and made myself some tea. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in the mirror. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I brushed it off as a one-time occurrence and went to bed convincing myself that I was just imagining things. But the next few nights it happened again. Every time I passed the hallway mirror, I felt like something was watching me. I'd catch the strange shadowy figure in the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish. When I looked directly at it, the weird thing was it wasn't just a shadow. It felt like something. Was there something present lurking waiting for me to notice? I started to avoid the mirror altogether, but it was impossible to ignore the sense of unease it brought with it. I'd feel its presence at all hours, when I was in the living room, when I was cooking, when I was lying in bed trying to sleep. It was as though it had somehow attached itself to the apartment, and I was just an unwitting part of its twisted game. The real horror started one evening when I got home from work and decided to face it head on. I was sick of feeling like I was losing my mind, so I stood in front of the mirror, determined to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. I stared at my reflection for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the shadows, the odd shifts in my features, but nothing happened. For a moment I thought maybe I had been imagining everything. Then, as I was about to turn away, I saw it. My reflection wasn't moving with me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a delayed reaction from the way I'd shifted my weight, but no, the reflection stood still. Its eyes locked on me and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to move again, my fingers gripping the edge of the mirror as I leaned forward, but my reflection stayed still. It was like I was looking at someone else, someone who looked like me but wasn't quite right. The mouth twisted into a small mocking smile and then it spoke, "Leave." The voice was mine, but it was distorted, hollow, twisted and full of malice. My heart raced in my chest as I backed away from the mirror. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection. It wasn't me anymore, it wasn't anything human. The reflection in the mirror slowly reached up, running its fingers across the glass. It was almost like it was testing the surface, like it was trying to find a way out, and then I saw it. The fingers of my reflection began to press against the mirror, pushing through the glass, leaving ripples in the air as though the surface wasn't solid anymore. A cold breeze rushed through the apartment and I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body paralyzed with fear, and then I saw the reflection step out of the mirror. It wasn't exactly like it was coming to life, more like it was emerging, slipping out from the boundaries of the glass, as though it were made of smoke. Its face was still twisted into that sickening smile, but its eyes, those eyes, were filled with something dark, something ancient. It didn't speak again, but I knew what it wanted. It wanted me. Without thinking, I bolted from the apartment, my heart pounding. As I slammed the door shut behind me, I ran down the hallway, down the stairs and out into the cold night air, desperate to escape the apartment and whatever had come through that cursed mirror. I spent the night in a nearby diner, too terrified to return. When I finally gathered the courage to go back the next morning, I found the apartment exactly as I had left it. The door was locked, the lights were off, and there was no sign of the horror I had experienced the night before. I don't know if it was real or if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was a dream, a product of my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But there's one thing I can't explain. When I looked into the mirror again that morning, I didn't see my own reflection. I saw that thing and it was smiling at me. I moved out of the apartment shortly after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had encountered there had followed me. I tried to leave everything behind, but I've never been able to escape the memory of that twisted reflection. Sometimes, when I pass by mirrors in dark places, I can't help but look, and every time I swear I see it watching, waiting just behind my own image. When I was growing up, I loved spending weekends with my grandfather at his cabin. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles away from any neighbors, perched at the edge of a dense forest. It was a quiet, peaceful place with no distractions. My grandfather, a quiet and wise man, always made it a point to teach me about nature, the land, and the strange things he'd encountered over his many years living in isolation. But it was during one of those weekends that I had my first encounter with something that defied explanation, a memory that still haunts me to this day. I was about 14. At the time my parents were busy and my grandfather had invited me to spend a long weekend with him at the cabin. It was early fall, the air crisp, with the promise of winter. We spent most of our time hiking through the forest, collecting firewood and enjoying the kind of quiet that only a remote cabin can offer. There was a sense of serenity there. Nothing seemed out of place until the evening of the third day. That evening, my grandfather and I sat on the porch drinking tea as we watched the sunet over the horizon. The woods around us seemed to stretch on forever, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of crickets. I remember feeling at ease, as I always did when I was with him. But something changed as the evening drew on. The wind picked up, blowing through the trees with a strange eerie hiss. It wasn't the kind of wind that simply rustled the leaves. This wind felt purposeful, as though it was carrying a message. My grandfather, who rarely spoke unless necessary, stood up abruptly and glanced toward the trees. His expression, which had always been calm, suddenly hardened. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and serious. "I think it's time we head inside." I remember thinking it was odd. My grandfather had always been an outdoorsman, never one to shy away from the woods. But that night something was different. I didn't question him, though. Instead I followed him into the cabin, where we secured the door behind us and sat by the fire. He didn't speak much after that, and I was left to wonder what had unsettled him. As night fell, I began to hear it. At first it was faint, just a soft whisper on the wind. I thought it was the wind itself, carrying the sounds of the forest, but then it grew louder. It wasn't just a whisper, but a voice low, unintelligible, as though a dozen voices were murmuring. All at once, their words tangled in the air. I looked at my grandfather, who was staring into the fire, his face unreadable. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the flames. "The woods are talking." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I could sense the tension in his voice. The whispers outside grew louder, more distinct, as though they were closing in on the cabin. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, trying to reach us. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed at the door, making both of us jump. I felt my blood run cold. The knock was slow, deliberate, almost like someone was testing the door to see if it would open. My grandfather didn't move. He just stared at the door, his eyes narrowing, and then, without a word, he stood up and walked over to the window. He peeked through the curtains, his hand resting on the wood of the window frame. He didn't say anything, but I saw the tension in his face, the way his body tensed, as though he was preparing for something. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The whispers outside the cabin faded and the wind died down. But it was then that I noticed something else. The air was thick, oppressive, as though something was hanging in the space between us and the outside world. "Grandpa, what's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. He turned to face me, his expression grave. "You need to listen carefully and don't interrupt me. There are things in those woods, things that have been there longer than anyone can remember. They aren't just trees and animals, there's something else, something older, something that watches." I felt a chill run through me as I listened to his words. It sounded almost like a warning, but I couldn't understand it. What did he mean by things in the woods? "They whisper," he continued, his voice soft, as though recounting an old memory. "They can mimic sounds, even voices. They want you to listen, they want to be heard." Just then the wind picked up again and the whispering returned louder, now more urgent. I could hear what sounded like my own name carried on the wind. It sounded so real, so familiar that for a moment I almost stepped outside as if compelled by some invisible force, but my grandfather grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't listen to them," he said firmly. "Whatever you hear, don't go out there." I was confused, terrified, and a little skeptical. It didn't make sense. How could the woods be alive? How could they be calling to us? The whispers grew louder, almost overwhelming. My grandfather sat me down near the fire and spoke to me in a low voice. "You need to understand something. The woods can take things. They can take people, memories, and even the sound of your voice. Don't let them trick you. If you go outside, you might never come back." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, and for the first time I truly believed that something terrible lurked just beyond the cabin's walls. I asked him why we were even here, if the woods were so dangerous, and he explained that he had come to the cabin years ago to keep the thing in the woods from finding him. He had heard the whispers before, years earlier, and knew better than to ignore them. He told me that the woods had been silent for many years, but now they were calling again. For the rest of the night, we stayed inside the cabin, the air thick with tension. We listened to the whispers grow and then fade as though something was pacing around the cabin. Every time the wind picked up, the whispers would start again, more insistent, more desperate. It was as if they were trying to lure us out, but we resisted. Finally, as dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's windows, the whispers stopped, the air lightened and the oppressive feeling lifted. My grandfather, though exhausted, seemed to relax. He explained that the whispers had always been part of the woods, but they were more dangerous at night, when the boundary between our world and theirs was weakest. From that night onward, I never doubted the things my grandfather had taught me. I returned to the cabin with him several more times, but each time I stayed inside after dark I never ventured near the woods again. My grandfather passed away a few years later and I took over the cabin. But every time I stand at the edge of the forest, I feel a presence, an ancient quiet force watching from the shadows, and if I listen closely enough, I can still hear the whispers calling me by name, urging me to come closer, but I don't listen anymore, I know better now. It was the kind of house that seemed perfect at first, a quiet, affordable place on the outskirts of town. I had just gotten a new job and after months of searching for a place to live, this little two-bedroom cottage seemed like a dream. The BUU rent was cheap, the house was well maintained and the surrounding neighborhood was peaceful, the perfect escape from the busy, noisy city life I was used to. The first few weeks were blissfully normal. I spent my evenings unpacking, getting to know the area and settling into a routine. The neighbors, though mostly quiet, were friendly when we did cross paths. There was Mr. and Mr. S. Taylor next door, an older couple who seemed harmless enough, and the couple across the street, the Parks, who were young and friendly, always waving when they passed by. However, there was one thing that stood out from the start. The house next to mine, the one at the very end of the street, tucked away from the others by a thick row of trees and shrubbery. It had always been vacant every time I walked by. It seemed lifeless, abandoned even, but still kept up, with the grass trimmed and the windows washed. It struck me as odd, but not in a way that made me overly suspicious, more like a curiosity that I couldn't quite shake. One night, about 3 weeks after I moved in, I decided to go for a late night walk. I was feeling restless and thought the cool night air would help clear my head. I didn't expect to see much. The neighborhood was mostly dark at that time, with only the occasional street light casting long eerie shadows on the pavement. As I walked past the house at the end of the street, I noticed something strange. A light flickered faintly from one of the upstairs windows. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe just a neighbor coming home, but then the light flickered again, this time more persistently. I froze staring at the window. The glow was dim, but it was unmistakable, a soft yellow light, as though someone had turned on a lamp inside. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide if I should investigate. It wasn't my place to be snooping around, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the house, my footsteps muffled by the wet grass, and paused by the fence. I tried to peer through the trees to see if anyone was inside, but all I could see was the faint glow in the upstairs window. I felt a chill run down my spine as though something wasn't right. The house had been empty for as long as I had lived here, and I couldn't fathom why there would be a light on. After a few moments of hesitation, I turned and walked back toward my own house, shaking off the feeling of unease. That night I couldn't shake the image of the light from my mind. I kept wondering if I'd imagined it or if it had some rational explanation. Still a nagging feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. The next day I decided to take a closer look at the house. I casually walked past it, trying to look inconspicuous. As I surveyed the area, the front door was slightly ajar, though I wasn't sure if it had always been that way. The yard was neat as usual and there was no sign of movement inside. Days passed and I began to forget about the house. The weather got warmer and I spent more time outside, settling into the routine of daily life. I'd see the tailor tending to their garden or the parks walking their dog, and life seemed to return to normal. But every time I passed the house at the end of the street, the strange unease would return. Then it happened. One evening, as the sun began to set, I was out on the front porch enjoying a glass of wine after a long day. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, and I couldn't help but notice that there were no lights on in the houses around me. The street seemed unusually still. As I glanced down the road, my heart skipped a beat. The house at the end of the street, next to the thick row of trees, was lit up. The windows glowed brightly from the inside, the same soft yellow light I had seen before. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. My curiosity, and perhaps my foolishness, got the better of me once again. I grabbed my keys and, with a sense of unease hanging over me, I walked down the street, my eyes locked on the glowing windows. As I reached the front gate of the house, the door, which had been ajar the last time I had checked, was now wide open. The air felt heavy, thick, with an oppressive silence. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Should I go in? Should I knock? I had no idea why I felt compelled to investigate further, but something deep within me urged me to step inside, pushed the gate open, the rusty hinges squealing as I moved cautiously toward the door. It was strange how quiet it was. There were no sounds, no dogs barking, no cars passing by, not even the usual hum of crickets. It was as though the entire world had gone. Still I reached for the door, and just as my fingers touched the cold metal knob, I heard it, a sound from inside the house, a soft thud, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. I pulled my hand back, startled. My mind raced as I tried to process what I had just heard. Was someone home, or had I just imagined it? I stood frozen for a few seconds, listening intently. Then, from inside the house, I heard something else, a soft whispering. At first I couldn't make out the words, but as I strained to listen, I realized that the whispers were unmistakably clear. They were voices, but not voices of anyone. I knew they were distant, hollow, almost as if they were coming from another room, or perhaps even from somewhere beneath the house. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling. This wasn't just my imagination. There was something wrong here, something that I couldn't explain. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. I had no idea who or what was inside, but I knew I wasn't welcome. I turned and walked away quickly, the whispers still echoing in my mind the next day. I couldn't get the events of the previous evening out of my head. The house, the light, the whispers. Something was very wrong, and I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. I decided to talk to Mr. Taylor, the older man who lived next door. He had lived in the neighborhood for years, and I thought he might know something about the house at the end of the street. When I asked him about it, he grew strangely quiet. He looked away, almost as if he was afraid to speak. That house, he began, his voice low and hesitant, has been empty for years. Nobody goes near it. Nobody ever talks about it either. It's best you leave it alone. His words sent a chill down my spine, but he didn't elaborate further. I could tell that whatever was going on in that house was something the neighbors had known about for a long time but didn't want to talk about. Over the following days I kept a distance from the house, but the sense of unease remained. I never saw anyone come or go, but the lights would still flicker in the windows at night, and the whispers would echo through the air when I was close. I don't know what's in that house, but I'm certain of one thing. There is something there, something I was never meant to understand to this day. The house still stands at the end of the street, vacant and silent, but when the wind picks up and the light flickers in the window, I know I'm not the only one watching. It was late autumn when I moved into the old house. The place was built back in the 1920s, and it had a certain charm to it, even if it was a little run down. The previous tenants had left suddenly, and the house had sat empty for several months, which worked out perfectly for me. I was looking for a new start, away from the noise of the city. The rent was cheap, and the owner was eager to lease it out. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect, in fact. I first noticed something was off. On the very first night, the house creaked and groaned as the wind blew through the trees outside, but there was one sound that didn't belong, a faint tapping noise. At first I thought it was just the house settling the way old buildings do, but as the night wore on, it became more persistent. The tap, tap, tap came from the walls, steady and rhythmic. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. After all, old houses make strange noises all the time, but the noise continued every night, and each time it seemed to grow louder, as if whatever was making it was getting closer. I told myself that I was just being paranoid. I had moved here to get away from everything, away from the stress, the city, the noise, and yet I was starting to feel uneasy in my own home. I decided to ignore the sound and focus on settling in. But the tapping didn't stop. It wasn't just at night either. Sometimes during the day when I was sitting quietly in my living room or doing something in the kitchen, I would hear it tap, tap, tap. It was always there, lurking just behind the walls. At first it was only in the walls closest to the living room, but after a week or so I noticed it was coming from other parts of the house too, beneath the floors, above the ceiling, and sometimes even from the corner of the attic. One afternoon after I had gotten off work, I had had enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer and some nails and marched over to the wall where the tapping was the loudest. I was determined to find the source of the sound and fix whatever was causing it. With a few swift hits, I made a small hole in the wall. At first there was nothing but the dark space behind it. Then, just as I was about to give up, a cold gust of air rushed out from within. It wasn't a draft. It was more like a breath, as if something had been waiting there hidden for a long time. Hesitated, but curiosity won out. I pulled the hole open wider, my heart pounding in my chest. As I did, a small object rolled out from the gap. At first I couldn't tell what it was, but when I picked it up I realized it was a small, old-fashioned key. I froze. The key didn't look like it belonged to anything in the house. It was rusty, tarnished, and had an intricate design etched into its surface. It was clear that it had been there for years, maybe even decades. I stood there holding the key, unsure of what to do next. What was it for and, more importantly, why had it been hidden in the wall? I decided to search the house for a lock that matched the key. I scoured every room, examining every door, every drawer, every cabinet. Nothing. There was no lock, no keyhole that could match the strange key. But then I remembered the attic. The attic was small and cramped, barely large enough to stand up in. I had only been up there once when I first moved in, and I hadn't paid much attention to it. But now the thought of that dusty, neglected space gave me an uneasy feeling. With the key in hand, I climbed up into the attic. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, and the air grew colder the higher I went. When I reached the top, I stood there for a moment, gathering my courage. I could feel something in the air, an unsettling heaviness like a weight pressing down on me. It was as if I had stepped into a place where time stood still. I looked around and my eyes fell on a small weathered chest in the far corner of the room. It was partially covered by a pile of old blankets and boxes, but the chest was unmistakable. The rusted metal lock on it seemed to match the key I had found in the wall. My hand trembled as I walked over to it. My heart was racing and I could feel a strange mixture of dread and anticipation building in my chest. I inserted the key into the lock and with a soft click it turned. The chest creaked open slowly and I was hit by the stale, musty smell of old wood and dust. At first all I could was darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the faint outline of something inside. I reached in my fingers, brushing against something soft and cold, pulling it out. I found an old leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age and the leather cover was cracked and worn. I flipped it open and the first page was covered with strange scrawled handwriting. The words were barely legible, but one thing was clear: the journal was not written by a normal person. It looked like the ramblings of someone who had lost their mind, someone who had been driven to madness by something in that very house. The entries were dated from decades ago, and as I read my stomach churned. The writer spoke of strange noises coming from the walls. Tapping sounds, whispers at night, just like what I had been hearing. But the most disturbing part was when the writer mentioned something or someone living within in the walls. The journal spoke of a man, a figure who had been trapped inside the house for years, hidden away in the walls, waiting for someone to find him. The writer had tried to escape, but he was too late. The man in the walls had already claimed him. Felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read the words. The last entry was hastily written, the letters barely legible. It simply said, "He's here, he's been waiting." I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my breath quickening, my palms sweaty. It was then that I heard it again, the tapping louder than ever. It came from within the walls, the floorboards, the ceiling. The tapping wasn't just a noise anymore, it was a message, a warning. I dropped the journal and fled from the attic, my mind racing. The tapping grew louder as I ran down the stairs, but it didn't stop. When I reached the bottom, it followed me like a shadow moving from room to room, echoing throughout the house. That night I packed my things. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't ignore the terror that had gripped me. I left the house in the dead of night, never looking back. I don't know what happened to the house after I left. I never went back to check, but I still hear the tapping, sometimes late at night when the wind is still and the air is thick with silence. It's a reminder of the man in the walls, the one who waits for someone else to discover the truth, and I pray that no one ever does. I had always been the adventurous type, someone who liked to explore the unknown, and that's why, when I stumbled across the old farmhouse, I felt an irresistible pull to check it out. It had been abandoned for years, nestled deep in the woods on the outskirts of town. The locals would whisper about it, saying it was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not back then. I thought it would be just another old house, maybe a little spooky, but nothing more. It was a late afternoon when I first arrived. The sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow over the surrounding trees. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a clearing, its silhouette looming against the darkening sky. It looked like something out of an old horror movie, dilapidated, with broken windows and a sagging room roof. The wind blew through the trees, sending leaves rustling across the ground. Despite its state of disrepair, there was a certain eerie beauty about it that intrigued me. I parked my car on the side of the overgrown path and stepped out the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the only sound breaking the silence. The air was thick with moisture, and a fog had begun to creep in from the forest. The farmhouse felt like it had been forgotten by time, left to decay while the world moved on around it. I made my way toward the front door, which hung loosely on its hinges. The wood groaned under my touch as I pushed it open inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of rotting wood and mildew. Dust danced in the beams of the setting sun that filtered through the gaps in the walls. The house seemed abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. Like it was waiting for me, I stepped inside and looked around. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust and the floor creaked with every step I took. There was a staircase leading up to the second floor. Its banister cracked and splendid. Everything in the house seemed to be frozen in time, as if the people who once lived here had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. As I explored, I came across an old wooden chest in one of the rooms. It was locked, but the rusted hinges were easy to break open. Inside I found a collection of old photographs and personal items, nothing particularly valuable, just memories left behind. But as I sifted through the contents, something caught my eye, a small journal bound in worn leather. Its pages yellowed with age. I opened it. My curiosity piqued. The first few pages were filled with what appeared to be the ramblings of a troubled mind. The handwriting was messy, erratic, almost as if the writer had been in a hurry. The entries were dated from years ago, and as I read I began to get a sense of unease. The writer spoke of strange occurrences in the house, whispers in the night shadows that moved on their own, and a constant feeling of being watched. But it was the last entry that made my blood run cold. It read, "I hear them again, the shadows. They're watching me. They're waiting for me to leave, but I can't escape them. They're inside the walls. They know I'm here. I hear their whispers and I know they want me." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I suddenly felt very aware of the silence that had enveloped the house. The quiet seemed unnatural, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just an old journal written by someone who had been alone for too long. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like something was wrong. I decided to leave the house after all. I had come here to explore, not to get caught up in some creepy story. But as I turned to leave, I heard a sound from upstairs. It was faint at first, just a soft creaking, but then it grew louder, as if something or someone was moving around upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I knew no one else had been here, and the house was too old for the wind to cause that much noise. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. The logical part of me told me to leave to run, but the curious part of me wanted to investigate. After all, what could it be? A raccoon in the attic? Or maybe just the house settling? But as I started to ascend the stairs, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just creaking, it was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the empty house. My pulse quickened and I found myself moving toward the sound, my feet carrying me up the stairs. Despite my better judgment, when I reached the top, the house was even darker, the fog outside thickening, the air felt colder and I could almost see my breath in the dim light. I looked down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my weight. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. The footsteps were coming from behind it. I pushed the door open, my hands trembling. The room was small, almost like a storage space, and it was filled with old furniture and cobwebs. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. Indra. The corner of the room, just barely visible in the low light, was a figure, a man. He was hunched over his back to me as if he hadn't heard me enter. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, his hair long and matted. But the most disturbing thing was the way he was standing unnaturally, still as if he were waiting for something or someone. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this man? How had he gotten into the house? I took a step forward, but the moment my foot touched the floor, the man jerked his head toward me. His eyes were wide, wild, and unblinking. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, one that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. The air grew even colder and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice rasping like dry leaves. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My instinct screamed at me to run to get out of there, but my body refused to move. The man continued to stare at me, his grin widening. His eyes filled with an unholy hunger. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. The man was on top of me in an instant, his cold, clammy hands gripping my wrists. His breath was hot and foul against my face, and I could feel the weight of his body pressing down on me. His grin never faltered. "You're mine now," he hissed. Panic flooded my system. With all my strength, I managed to push him off. Scrambling to my feet, I turned and ran, not stopping to look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me growing closer, but I didn't dare look. My heart was pounding in my ears as I reached the stairs and raced down, nearly tumbling in my haste when I finally burst out the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, slammed the door shut and sped off into the night, my mind racing what had just happened. Who was that man and why was he in that house? I never went back to the farmhouse. I didn't even tell anyone about what I'd seen. It felt insane, like something I had imagined. But I still hear his voice, sometimes late at night when I'm alone, the whispering, the promise, "You're mine now," and I know deep down that whatever was in that farmhouse is still waiting, still watching, waiting for someone else to step into the shadows. It was the fall of 2013 when I made the decision that would change my life forever. I had just moved to a small town on the edge of the forest, looking to escape the noise of the city. The town itself was quiet, almost too quiet, and had a strange charm. Old houses lined the streets, their paint peeling but still standing strong, and the people were friendly in an almost cautious way. The townspeople rarely spoke about the woods that bordered the town, and when they did it was only in hushed tones. I'd heard the stories about the forest before, whispers of strange sounds at night, eerie figures seen wandering near the tree line, and unexplained disappearances. But being a skeptic and wanting a break from the chaos of urban life, I didn't think much of it. The idea of living near the forest was appealing. I loved the thought of being close to nature, surrounded by trees and fresh air. The stories were just that, stories in my mind. It was on my third evening in the town that I decided to take a walk through the woods. The crisp air of autumn was invited and the trees seemed to glow in the soft, fading light of the setting sun. I figured I could explore for an hour or so, get some fresh air and clear my mind. After all, what harm could there be in walking through the woods? The forest was dense, with thick trees and winding paths that seemed to go on forever. As I ventured deeper, The sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves in the occasional bird call. The further I walked, the quieter it became. At one point I stopped to listen, only to realize that there were no birds singing, no sounds of animals moving through the brush. It was as if the forest itself had fallen into a deep, unsettling silence. I shook off the strange feeling creeping up my spine and continued down the narrow path, pushing through the thick undergrowth. The air was growing colder and the shadows between the trees deepened as the sunset. I thought about turning back, but I was too far in now. It didn't seem right to head back before seeing at least a little more of the forest. That's when I heard the whisper. It started faintly, like the wind, carrying someone's voice through the trees. At first I thought it was just my imagination, the wind playing tricks on me, but then it came again clearer, this time, though still distant. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was someone calling. After out. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart rate picking up. There was no one else in the woods with me, or so I thought. I looked around, but the trees were thick and the shadows seemed to stretch further than before. The whisper came again, this time from behind me. It was close now, too close to be the wind. I spun around, but the path was empty. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time since arriving in this town, I felt a genuine fear creep into my bones. I should have left then. I should have turned around and run back toward the safety of the town, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something. Curiosity, or maybe some foolish part of me, kept me rooted to the spot, straining to hear the whisper again. It came once more, this time unmistakably clear. "Come closer," it said, a voice soft and eerie. It was not a voice I recognized, but it sounded familiar, like something from a dream. I turned back toward the path and took a hesitant step forward, unsure if I was making a huge mistake, but the pull of that voice, strange and inviting, was too strong. I took another step, then another, until I found myself walking deeper into the woods following the whisper. As I moved forward, the air grew heavier, thicker. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching me, pressing in around me. The trees seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches twisting into shape. That looked almost human. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It felt as though the very ground beneath my feet was whispering to me, urging me on. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small clearing. The trees parted, revealing a strange stone circle at the center. The stones were worn ancient, their surfaces covered in moss and lion. They were arranged in a perfect ring, as though placed there deliberately. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my instinct screamed at me to leave, but the whisper called out again. "Step into the circle." I hesitated. Something about the place, the air, the stones. It all felt wrong, but the voice was so insistent, so certain I couldn't help myself. I took a step into the center of the stone circle. The moment my foot touched the ground, the world seemed to shift. The trees around me blurred and the sky above darkened, though it was still early evening. The ground beneath me felt cold, unnaturally so, and I could feel an unsettling pressure building in my chest. My breath quickened and I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out from behind the trees. They were tall, their faces obscured by hoods, but I could sense their eyes, cold and unblinking, fixed on me. The whispering grew louder. A chorus of voices all saying the same thing. "Stay with us." Panic surged through me. My legs felt weak and I stumbled backward, trying to leave the circle. But something held me there. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figures advanced, their movements smooth, unnatural. Their hands reached toward me, their fingers long and skeletal. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry and my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the pressure in the air around me suffocating me. The figures stopped just outside the circle, their faces still hidden. One of them spoke its voice, a low, rasping whisper. "You should not have come now, you belong to the woods." The words sent a chill through me. I didn't understand what was happening. What did they mean before I could react? The ground beneath me began to tremble and the air grew colder. Still, a gust of wind howled through the clearing, knocking me off my feet. I cried out, scrambling to stand, but the pressure on my chest grew even more unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the forest fell silent again. The figures were gone, the whispering ceased, and the forest was once again still. I lay there in the dirt, gasping for air, my heart pounding. I was alone. I didn't waste a second. I stumbled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was safely back in the town, my legs aching, my breath ragged. I never spoke of what happened in those woods to anyone, but I knew deep down that I had encountered something I couldn't explain. I left the town not long after that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was calling me back, that the figures were waiting, lurking in the shadows. I'll never know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: the woods were alive in a way I could never have imagined, and I'll never go near that place again. It was in the early spring of 2016 when I moved into my first apartment on my own. It was a small one-bedroom place located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and it seemed like a good deal at the time. Too good to pass up. The landlord, an older man with a stern demeanor, was the only one I'd met during the application process. He had been vague about the history of the apartment, but I didn't think much of it. I was just eager to have my own space. The apartment was modest, with creaky floors and an old-fashioned layout, but it had its charm, particularly the large mirror that hung in the living room. It was one of those antique-style mirrors with a heavy gilded frame. I'd always loved mirrors and found them fascinating, so I immediately decided to keep it in the apartment. The landlord hadn't mentioned anything about it, so I assumed it had just been left behind by the previous tenant. The first few days in the apartment were uneventful. I unpacked my things, decorated the space and settled in, but as the days wore on, I began to notice something strange about the mirror. It wasn't anything overt, but there was an odd feeling. Whenever I looked at it, the reflection seemed off. At times I would catch glimpses of something that didn't quite match up with what I saw in the room. I would chalk it up to the lighting or my tired eyes, but the feeling persisted. One evening, after a long day of work, I was sitting on the couch watching TV. I didn't realize it at first, but I'd been absent-mindedly staring at the mirror. My reflection, as usual, seemed fine at first, but then something strange happened. My reflection didn't match my movements. I turned my head to the left, but the reflection in the mirror stayed still staring straight ahead. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly looked away from the mirror, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. I rationalized it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just too tired to focus properly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days passed uneventfully, though I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. I began to notice that the odd occurrences were happening more frequently. Sometimes I would see a flicker of movement in the mirror when I was certain there was nothing in the room with me. At other times I would catch my reflection doing things I wasn't doing, like tilting its head or smiling when I wasn't. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was simply overthinking it. But deep down I knew something was wrong. It was one rainy evening when everything changed. I had just gotten home from work feeling exhausted. The storm outside had darkened the sky, and the sound of rain hitting the windows only added to the heavy atmosphere in the apartment. I had just finished dinner and was relaxing on the couch. When I felt that familiar, unsettling pull toward the mirror, I couldn't help it. I stood up and walked over to it. As I stared at my reflection, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This time the reflection wasn't like it had been before. My face was pale, almost gaunt, and my eyes seemed unnaturally wide, as if something was staring back at me from within the mirror. It felt as though the reflection wasn't me at all. I blinked, hoping the image would return to normal, but it didn't. The reflection grinned a wide, malicious grin that I hadn't made. I took a step back, my heart racing, but the reflection didn't stop. It continued to smile, its eyes following my every movement, but it didn't mimic me. It was like it was alive, watching me, waiting. I turned away from the mirror, but the smile lingered in my mind. I knew something had to be wrong. I rushed to the phone and called the landlord. My hands trembled as I spoke to him. "I don't know what's happening," I said. "There's something wrong with the mirror in the living room. My reflection. It's not like it's supposed to be. It's different." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a low, almost whispering voice, the landlord spoke. "You shouldn't have kept it." I was taken aback by his response. "What do you mean? What's wrong with the mirror?" He sighed. "That mirror has a history. It belonged to a woman who lived in that apartment many years ago. She was a tenant before you. She was well. She wasn't right in the head, spent hours staring into that mirror, convinced that someone was watching her. One night she went mad. She took her own life in front of it." I froze. "What are you talking about? What happened?" The landlord's voice dropped even lower. "The reflection in that mirror. It doesn't just reflect you, it shows something else, something that's always there. I thought you might have noticed by now. It's not just a mirror, it's something much darker." I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what he was saying. "You never told me any of this. Why didn't you warn me? I didn't think you'd take it seriously. I didn't think you'd keep it. You have to get rid of it. Get it out of your apartment or it'll get worse." The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, my mind racing. Was this some sort of sick joke? How could a mirror do something like that? I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that was creeping up on me that night. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the grin of my reflection widening, twisting into something sinister. I felt as though I wasn't alone anymore, as if the mirror was watching me from across the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, left the apartment and went straight to the landlord's office. When I arrived, I demanded to know what to do with the mirror. "You have to get rid of it." He repeated, his face. "Grave, burn it, destroy it. It's the only way to stop it." That night, I took the mirror outside and set it in the middle of the yard. I had no idea how to destroy it, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving it in my apartment any longer. I set it on fire. As the flames consumed the mirror, I felt a strange sense of relief. The sinister presence I had felt for days seemed to vanish with the smoke. I thought that would be the end of it, that I could finally move on. But the next morning, when I woke up and looked into the bathroom mirror, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. It was the same grin, the same wide, malicious smile. But this time it wasn't just in the mirror. It was in my own face. I had no idea how, but I knew one thing for sure: the mirror wasn't done with me yet. It was the summer of 2018 when I found myself renting a small rustic cottage deep in the woods. I had just come off a stressful year, and the idea of being alone in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, felt like the perfect escape. I had scoured multiple listings before stumbling upon this one, hidden on the edge of a sleepy town. The ad promised peace and tranquility, and after speaking to the owner, an older woman named Elena, I knew it was exactly what I needed. The Sear cottage was charming, with an old stone exterior and ivy creeping up the sides. The inside was just as cozy, filled with vintage furniture and a crackling fireplace. It was perfect for someone seeking isolation. Eleanor had warned me in passing that the cottage had a bit of a history, but she brushed it off as nothing to be concerned about. She didn't go into details, and I didn't press. I was looking for peace, not ghost stories. The first few days went by without incident. I spent my time hiking through the woods, reading by the fire and enjoying the quiet. The cottage had no television or internet, just books and a record player that gave off a soft, crackling sound when the needle dropped. It was the perfect retreat, but then, on the fifth night, something strange happened. I had just finished reading a novel and was preparing for bed when I heard a noise coming from the walls. At first I thought it was the house settling. The cottage was old after all, but then the sound became more distinct, soft whispers, like faint voices coming from inside the walls. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't the kind of sound you could ignore. It was too deliberate, too real. I stood up and pressed my ear against the wall, trying to hear more clearly. The whispers were muffled, but they were definitely there. They seemed to come from all sides of the room surrounding me. I backed away, a cold chill spreading through my body. My first instinct was to call Eleanor, but I wasn't sure if she'd even pick up. I had barely spoken to her since I arrived, so instead I did what I had done for the past few days. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the wind, Perhaps animals were inside the walls creating strange sounds, but as the night went on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to echo from the far corners of the room. I could hear them clearly now, words unintelligible at first, but growing more distinct. They weren't speaking in English or any language I recognized. It sounded like a jumble of guttural sounds, strange and unsettling. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Eleanor, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. The cottage was in the middle of nowhere, far from any cell towers. I was alone, with nothing but the voices whispering from the walls. I couldn't stay in that room any longer, so I grabbed a flashlight and bolted outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face as I stumbled onto the porch. The whispers seemed to follow me now, coming from the walls of the cottage itself. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the yard was empty. Only the trees swayed in the wind. I spent the rest of the night outside, huddled by the fire pit, trying to calm myself. The whispers didn't stop. They had been there all night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer. It wasn't just the walls. They seemed to be coming from the very ground beneath me. The earth itself seemed to hum with strange energy, and the longer I sat there, the more it felt as though something was watching me. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, but I felt safer with the daylight. The whispers had stopped, leaving an eerie silence behind. I decided to head into town to clear my head and hopefully find some answers. The small town was quaint, with cobblestone streets and little shops. I walked into a local diner hoping for a cup of coffee and maybe a conversation that could distract me from the night before the waitress. An older woman with sharp eyes seemed to know exactly why I was there. "You're staying in that old cottage, aren't you?" she asked. As she placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of me, I nodded, surprised that she knew. "Yeah, how did you know?" "Everyone knows," she replied, her voice lowering slightly. "That cottage has a history. It's not the kind of place you want to stay for too long." I frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "It seemed fine. When I got there, the waitress glanced over her shoulder as though making sure no one was listening that cottage. It's been empty for years. People come and go, but no one ever stays long. Strange things happen there, voices in the walls, whispers that don't stop. People say the place is cursed." A cold shiver ran down. My spine cursed. She nodded, her eyes narrowing. "You should leave before it's too late." I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest, but I didn't know what to do. I had nowhere else to go, and I wasn't about to just give up and leave. I finished my coffee in silence, the waitress's words echoing in my mind. When I returned to the cottage, the sun was setting and the darkness came quickly. I was determined to confront whatever was happening. I grabbed a hammer from the shed and began to knock on the walls, hoping to find something, anything that would explain the noises. I spent hours tapping on the walls, pressing my ear against them, but I found nothing. The house was solid, nothing more than an old building creaking in the night. But the moment I stopped hammering and stood in the silence, I could feel that something was wrong. Then, in the quiet, it began again, the whispers. This time they weren't muffled, they were clear and distinct. Coming from the far corner of the living room, I turned, heart hammering in my chest, and saw something I couldn't believe. In the shadows there was a figure, a tall, thin figure, standing just beyond the edge of the room. Its eyes glowed in the darkness. Two white orbs that seemed to pierce through me. The whispering came from it, from the shape itself. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was deafening. Now, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I froze, unable to move. It wasn't a person, it wasn't even human. The thing in front of me was a shape, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, and it was getting closer. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever, until they filled my head, drowned out all other sounds. I felt the walls closing in the air, growing thick with something I couldn't explain. The figure took a step forward and I stumbled back, tripping over a chair. My breath caught in my throat. I had to leave, I had to get out of there, but the door wouldn't open. I tugged at the handle, but it was locked, impossible. I had never locked it. I looked around in panic, searching for any way out. The figure was right in front of me now, its face still obscured by darkness, but I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, studying me, judging me. The whispers were deafening now, screaming in my ears with every ounce of strength I had. I broke the window, the glass shattered, and I crawled through, falling into the yard below. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the edge of the woods. The whispers faded and the chill lifted. I didn't go back to the cottage, I couldn't. I left the town that very night, driving far away, not stopping until I reached the next city. I still don't know what that thing was or why it was in that cottage, but one thing I do know for sure is that I will never forget the whispers or the thing that waited behind the walls. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. I had rented a cabin in the mountains to escape the pressures of my work life, just a few days alone, with nature, some books and the silence I longed for. No distractions, no phone calls, just me and the peace of the woods. I had found this cabin through a recommendation from a friend, and the pictures online made it look absolutely perfect. Cozy, secluded and surrounded by towering trees in a quiet stream. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. The air was fresh and crisp, a welcome change from the smog and noise of the city. The cabin itself was small but charming, made of dark wood with a stone fireplace and a few rustic decorations. It looked exactly like the peaceful retreat I needed. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bags and setting up for a few days of unwinding. The first evening was perfect. I spent some time on the porch, reading as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. As night fell, I built a fire in the fireplace and cooked myself a simple dinner. The silence was overwhelming at first, but after a while it became comforting. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uncomfortable. At first I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings, the isolation, and maybe a bit of anxiety creeping in. But then the feeling intensified. There was a presence, something else was in the cabin with me. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps animals moving around outside. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept hearing faint sounds like footsteps just outside the cabin. They were so soft that at first I wondered if I was imagining them, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. I decided to investigate, hoping to find a logical explanation. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and walked around the outside of the cabin, scanning the area for any signs of life. There was nothing. No animals, no other hikers or campers, and certainly no people, just the stillness of the woods, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I walked around the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off again and returned to the warmth of the cabin. I locked all the doors and windows, then settled onto the couch to read, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. But as the night deepened, the sounds returned, the quiet footsteps, almost like someone pacing around the outside of the cabin. The sound of scratching followed, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wood. It wasn't a noise I could easily ignore. It sounded like nails dragging along the side of the cabin, like something or someone was trying to get in. I jumped to my feet and grabbed the flashlight again. My heart was pounding in my chest as I rushed to the front door. I unlocked it and swung it open, hoping to catch whoever was outside in the ACT. But there was no one there, just the empty yard and the dark, sprawling woods. I didn't know what to think. There was no way someone could have been here without me noticing. I would have heard them approach or seen signs of movement. I double-checked the cabin's locks and bolted everything shut once more, but despite all my efforts to convince myself, it was nothing. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I went to bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, but sleep didn't come. Every creak and groan of the cabin sent me into a panic. Every gust of wind felt like it was something more sinister. At one point I thought I heard the distinct sound of breathing, soft and raspy, coming from somewhere in the room. My eyes shot open, but when I looked around there was nothing there, just the shadows cast by the flickering light of the fire. I finally fell into a restless sleep, but it was far from peaceful. The next morning I woke up to find my mind in a fog. I couldn't shake the feel that something had happened overnight, but I couldn't remember what. My body felt tense, like I hadn't slept at all. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, hoping the fresh mountain air would help. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, soothing even, but there was still that nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the trees themselves were watching me, their branches swaying in rhythm with my every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing. The woods were empty still. I couldn't shake the sense of dread. Later that afternoon, I decided to head into town for supplies. I hoped a change of scenery would help me forget the strange occurrences. I spoke to a few locals at the general store, but when I mentioned the cabin, their faces grew tense. That place. You should be careful. One of the older men warned me. There's a lot of story about that cabin. It's been abandoned for years. Folks say it's haunted. I smiled awkwardly, not wanting to acknowledge the fear in his eyes. Haunted. I asked more out of curiosity than belief. Why would anyone say that? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. People hear things, voices, footsteps, things scratching at the walls. Some folks say the place is cursed. I wouldn't stay there too long if I were you. I couldn't help but laugh it off. Of course people in a small town would have ghost stories. Everyone loves a good tale. But as I left the store, his words lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over my thoughts. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set again. I tried to ignore the feeling of unease, but it was there creeping into my bones. I made dinner hoping to relax, but as soon as I sat down to eat, the sounds returned, the faint whispers just out of reach, like voices carried on the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, the trees, or maybe some animal in the woods. But deep down I knew it wasn't. It felt like something was in the cabin with me. I could feel its presence just beyond the threshold of my perception. I decided to check the locks again just to be sure, and when I did I noticed something chilling there. On the inside of the front door were deep gouges, like claws, had scratched the wood from the inside out, as if someone or something had been trying to get in. I froze. The blood drained from my face. I checked the other doors and windows, but they were secure. I couldn't explain the scratches. No one had entered, no one had left, but the marks were undeniable. Then a voice in my head whispered, something I couldn't ignore. You're not alone. I grabbed my phone and called the authorities, but when they arrived, they found nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence of anything out of place. But they seemed uncomfortable as well, their eyes darting around the cabin as if they could feel the presence too. I didn't stay the night. I packed up my things and left, driving back into town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly. My knuckles turned white. I couldn't get the image of those claw marks out of my mind. The Weiss whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, they had all been real. The cabin remained vacant for years. No one else stayed there for long, and when I passed through the area the following year, I noticed the place had been abandoned once again, the shutters hanging crookedly and the door slightly ajar. Some things are better left alone, especially when they have a history of things that refuse to be forgotten. I'll never return to that cabin, no matter how quiet or peaceful it seems. Something lurks there, something that waits for the next unwitting guest, and I'm sure I was only the latest in a long line of people who learned the hard way that some places should never be explored.